There are places where the sea keeps secrets, and then there are places where the sea becomes the secret. Off the coast of Laconia, Greece, beneath 30 feet of Mediterranean blue, lies a city that shouldn't exist. Not because it's impossible, but because it's too perfect, too preserved, too deliberately arranged, as if someone knew the water was coming and decided to gift wrap a civilization for future archaeologists to unwrap, like a time capsule soaked in salt and silence. Pavlopetri. The name rolls off the tongue like an ancient prayer, but what it conceals beneath the waves is something far more unsettling than myth. This is not Atlantis. This is not legend. This is documented, mapped, measured reality sitting on the seafloor, like a fossilized scream. Discovered in 1967, when the Mediterranean grudgingly revealed one of its most jealously guarded possessions, Pavlopetri spans 30,000 square meters of perfectly preserved Bronze Age urbanity. 5,000 years old. That's not just ancient, that's antediluvian, and it's complete. Streets that still follow their original grid. Houses with rooms you could walk through, if you had gills. Courtyards where families once gathered, now hosting only fish and the occasional bewildered diver. But here's where the narrative breaks. Here's where science starts sweating. This city didn't decay. It didn't crumble. It didn't slowly sink into ruin over centuries of neglect and weather. Pavlopetri was flash frozen in time. One day it was a thriving Bronze Age settlement. The next day it was 20 meters underwater, preserved as if someone had hit the pause button on an entire civilization. The official story, earthquakes, tsunamis, gradual sea level rise, reads like a bureaucratic shrug. Something happened, probably natural, most likely explainable. But dive deeper into the data, and the cracks start showing. No definitive geological evidence, no clear seismic markers. No smoking gun that explains how an entire city becomes a perfectly preserved underwater museum. Walk through Pavlopetri's digital reconstructions, and you're not looking at ruins. You're looking at architecture interrupted. Doorways that lead to rooms with intact walls. Streets that curve with urban planning sophistication. A cemetery, yes, a cemetery, complete with graves that held their dead until the sea claimed both the living and the buried. And that's the part that makes your skin crawl. The skeletons. Still there. Still positioned as if death came calling, and then decided to stay for a Mediterranean swim. No signs of evacuation. No evidence of panic. No artifacts scattered in desperate flight. Just presence, and then absence, and then 5,000 years of silence beneath the waves. Divers who've explored Pavlopetri don't just report on architectural features, they report on atmosphere. That peculiar weight you feel when you're walking through a place that was lived in, loved in, died in, and then forgotten by everything except the water. Doorways that frame nothing but blue darkness. Streets that lead to nowhere but deeper water. The persistent sense that you're trespassing in a world that was never meant to be visited, only inhabited. The Bronze Age shouldn't have produced cities this sophisticated. That's the uncomfortable truth archaeology doesn't like to discuss. The urban planning, the infrastructure, the sheer scale of organization required to build and maintain Pavlopetri suggests a level of civilizational development that predates everything we think we know about Mediterranean Bronze Age capabilities. And then there's the preservation itself. Why this city? Why this level of intact detail? The Mediterranean isn't exactly gentle with its archaeological treasures. It's a sea that's been churning, storming, and reshaping coastlines for millennia. Yet Pavlopetri sits there like it was submerged yesterday, protected by 30 feet of water and 5,000 years of forgetting. No written records mention this place. No ancient texts reference its fall. No pottery shards tell its story. It existed, it thrived, it vanished, and history moved on without bothering to take notes. That's not how civilizations usually work. They leave traces, they leave stories, they leave something. But Pavlopetri left only itself. The mystery deepens when you consider the timing. 5,000 years ago puts us right in that uncomfortable zone where myth starts looking like memory. Right around the time when flood stories start appearing in cultures across the Mediterranean. Right when the Bronze Age is supposedly getting started, but here's a city that looks like the Bronze Age already knew what it was doing. What kind of event preserves a city so perfectly, while erasing it so completely from human memory? What kind of disaster leaves architecture intact, but removes every trace of why, how, or when. And most chillingly, what kind of silence lasts for 5 millennia until a curious diver in 1967 accidentally stumbles into a Bronze Age time capsule? Pavlopetri isn't just an archaeological site. It's a question mark written in stone and preserved in salt water. A reminder that the sea doesn't just hide fish and shipwrecks. Sometimes it hides entire chapters of human story that were never supposed to end underwater. And in that silence, in that perfectly preserved urban ghost town, lies a truth we're not quite ready to accept. That the ancient world was stranger, more sophisticated, and more fragile than we've ever dared to imagine. That cities could be built, lived in, and lost in ways that leave no trace except the cities themselves. The Mediterranean keeps many secrets, but Pavlopetri might be the most terrifying of all, not because of what it shows us, but because of what it suggests about everything else hidden beneath the waves, waiting for the next curious diver to discover that the ancient world was always deeper than we thought. Before we dive deeper into the next lost civilization, take a moment to subscribe if these mysteries intrigue you. We're just getting started on this journey through humanity's drowned past, and you won't want to miss what's waiting in the depths ahead. Each discovery we uncover seems to suggest that the ancient world held secrets we're only beginning to understand. Story 2. Lake Titicaca, Temple of the Impossible. There are temples built for gods, and then there are temples built by gods. At least, that's what the locals whispered when the news broke in 2000. Deep beneath Lake Titicaca, the world's highest navigable lake, sitting at an oxygen star of 12,500 feet above sea level, archaeologists had found something that challenged every assumption about ancient engineering, hydrology, and the basic laws of physics. A temple, underwater, at the top of the world. Lake Titicaca has always been sacred. The Inca called it the birthplace of the sun. The Aymara people speak of it as the navel of the world, the place where creation began and where the first peoples emerged from the depths. But they spoke in metaphors, in myths, in the kind of reverent poetry that civilizations use when they're trying to remember something too large for ordinary language. They weren't speaking in metaphors. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community that are still reverberating today. Because what lies beneath 20 meters of lake water isn't just a temple, it's a complex spanning 200 meters with intricately carved walls, terraces that climb toward a surface they'll never reach, and stone statues that have been staring into the liquid darkness for over 1,000 years. The Tiwanaku civilization built it, supposedly, between 500 and 1000 Common Era, when the pre-Columbian world was still figuring out how to stack stones into pyramids. These people allegedly designed, engineered, and constructed a massive stone temple complex that would make modern underwater architects weep with envy. But here's where the story starts eating its own tail. The temple is underwater, not partially submerged, not flood, damaged. Underwater, 20 meters down, complete and functional, and preserved as if it were built specifically to be a submarine cathedral. The engineering implications are staggering. To build underwater requires technology we're still perfecting today. Specialized equipment, watertight construction methods, understanding of water pressure, materials that can withstand constant submersion. These aren't skills you develop accidentally while building llama pens at altitude. The official explanation wobbles like a house built on quicksand. Maybe it was built on land and sank due to flooding. Possibly tectonic shifts dropped the entire structure into the lake. Theoretically, rising water levels gradually submerged what was once a terrestrial temple complex. But the evidence doesn't cooperate with the theory. No gradual submersion leaves stone carvings this crisp. No accidental sinking preserves architectural details this precisely. No natural disaster results in a temple complex that looks like it was designed to be underwater, complete with chambers that seem built for water circulation and drainage systems that make sense only in a submerged context. Walk the temple's digital reconstructions, because walking the actual site requires a submarine and a death wish, and you're not looking at a building that was awkwardly adapted to aquatic life. You're looking at architecture that embraces the water, works with it, almost seems to expect it. The stone faces carved into the walls don't look up toward the surface, in supplication or confusion. They stare outward into the lake's depths with the serene confidence of beings who know exactly where they are and why they're there. These aren't the expressions of a civilization that got blindsided by rising water levels. These are the faces of builders who knew precisely what they were creating. The location itself defies explanation. Lake Titicaca isn't just high, it's impossibly high for the kind of complex civilization the temple implies. At 12,500 feet, every aspect of life becomes a battle against physics. Oxygen levels that make complex thinking difficult, temperature variations that crack stone and freeze bone, atmospheric pressure that turns simple construction into an engineering nightmare. Yet here's a temple complex that required not just sophisticated engineering, but sophisticated underwater engineering, built by a civilization that wasn't supposed to exist at altitude, in a lake that wasn't supposed to be capable of supporting such construction. The Tiwanaku people left no written records explaining the temple. No instruction manuals, no construction logs, no architectural blueprints carved in stone. They built one of the most enigmatic structures in the ancient world, and then vanished into the thin air of the Altiplano without bothering to explain how, why, or for whom. Local legend fills the silence with stories that make archaeologists uncomfortable. Tales of a sacred city that angered the gods and was swallowed by the lake as divine punishment. Myths of underwater dwellers who built temples to commune with sky spirits. Oral traditions that speak of the lake as a portal, a gateway between worlds, guarded by structures that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Dismiss the folklore if you want, but folklore has an uncomfortable habit of being geographically accurate about things science hasn't figured out yet. The temple's preservation is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the discovery. The high-altitude environment and the lake's unique chemistry should have degraded organic materials, weakened stone joints, and slowly dissolved the structure over centuries. Instead, divers report chambers so well preserved they could have been abandoned last week. No human remains have been found in the temple complex. No artifacts indicating hurried evacuation. No signs of gradual abandonment or structural failure. Whatever happened to the builders, they left cleanly, completely, and apparently by choice. The silence beneath Lake Titicaca isn't empty, it's expectant, as if the temple is waiting for something, or someone, as if it was built not for the people who constructed it, but for visitors who haven't arrived yet. Modern diving technology allows us to explore the temple's chambers, map its corridors, and photograph its carvings, but it doesn't allow us to understand what we're looking at. Each new survey raises more questions than it answers. Each new discovery makes the mystery deeper rather than clearer. Why build a temple underwater at the top of the world? Why preserve it so perfectly for 1,000 years? Why leave no records, no explanations, no trace of the builders except the building itself? And perhaps most disturbingly, if the Tiwanaku could build this impossible temple beneath Lake Titicaca, what else did they build that we haven't found yet? What other engineering marvels lie hidden beneath lakes, rivers, and oceans, waiting for the right technology and the right questions to bring them back to light? The temple of Lake Titicaca stands or floats or hovers, depending on your perspective, as a reminder that the ancient world contained capabilities we don't understand, built structures we can't explain, and left behind mysteries we're not equipped to solve. But the water is patient. The temple waits, and somewhere in its submerged chambers lies the answer to questions we haven't learned how to ask. Story 3. Heracleion, the city that pharaohs forgot. Sometimes history lies by omission. Sometimes the most terrifying discoveries are the ones that reveal not what we knew was lost, but what we never knew existed in the first place. In the Mediterranean waters off Alexandria, beneath 30 feet of silt and silence, lies Heracleion, a city so magnificent, so integral to ancient Egyptian commerce and religion, that its complete erasure from historical memory feels less like forgetting and more like conspiracy. They called it Thonis in Egyptian, Heracleion in Greek. But names are just noise when you're staring at 16-foot granite statues of pharaohs still standing upright on the seafloor, their stone eyes gazing into an eternity of salt water and marine life, as if they've been holding court with fish for the past 12 centuries. This wasn't a village. This wasn't an outpost. Heracleion was Egypt's gateway to the Mediterranean world, a bustling port city where pharaohs collected taxes from foreign merchants, where priests performed sacred rituals in temples that rivaled Karnak, where 60 ships lie scattered across the seafloor like toys abandoned by an impatient god. And then it vanished. Not gradually, not over centuries of decline. Vanished. As if someone had pulled a cosmic drain plug and watched an entire civilization swirl into the Mediterranean depths. The rediscovery in 2000 wasn't just an archaeological triumph. It was an indictment of everything we thought we knew about ancient Egypt. How do you lose a major port city? How does a settlement that dominated Mediterranean trade for over 1,000 years simply disappear from every historical record, every papyrus scroll, every carved inscription? Walk through the underwater ruins, or rather, float through them with diving gear and a sense of existential dread, and you're not exploring a city that died slowly. You're swimming through a civilization that was flash-frozen in the middle of its daily routine. Colossal statues still stand guard at what were once temple entrances. Gold jewelry lies scattered in houses, as if their owners stepped out for a moment and never returned. Ships rest on the bottom with their cargo holds still sealed, as if they were waiting for a harbor that would never again break the surface. The preservation is wrong. It's too complete, too deliberate. The Mediterranean isn't gentle with its archaeological treasures. It's a sea that's been churning civilizations into sand for millennia. Yet Heracleion sits beneath the waves like an underwater museum, its details so crisp you can read the expressions on stone faces that haven't seen sunlight since the 8th century Common Era. The geological explanations sound increasingly desperate with each new survey. Earthquakes, they say. Tsunamis, land subsidence, the Nile Delta's inherent instability, all plausible. None sufficient to explain the sheer scale and suddenness of Heracleon's disappearance. Because this wasn't just a city, it was a system. A complex of temples, harbors, residential districts, and administrative buildings spanning multiple islands connected by bridges and canals. The kind of urban planning that takes generations to develop and centuries to perfect. The kind of place that doesn't just vanish without someone, somewhere, writing down what happened. Yet the historical record is blank. Not damaged, not fragmentary, blank. As if every scribe in the ancient world simultaneously decided that Heracleion was no longer worth mentioning. As if the city's existence became inconvenient to remember. The artifacts tell a different story than the silence. Temple inscriptions speak of royal ceremonies, diplomatic negotiations, religious festivals that drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. This was not a provincial outpost. This was a capital of commerce and culture, a place where pharaohs came to be seen, where foreign ambassadors came to negotiate, where the wealth of the ancient world flowed like water through carefully constructed channels. And then, nothing. The underwater archaeology reveals a moment frozen in catastrophe. Ships sunk not by weather or warfare, but by sudden, overwhelming disaster. Buildings collapsed not from age or neglect, but from forces that struck without warning. Statues toppled not by vandalism or erosion, but by an event so violent it could move 16-foot granite monuments. But what kind of event leaves no trace in the historical record? What kind of disaster erases a major city from human memory while preserving its physical remains in pristine detail? The diving teams report phenomena that sound more like folklore than archaeology. Chambers where the water seems to move with its own current, following patterns that don't match the Mediterranean's natural flow. Artifacts arranged in configurations that suggest ritual placement rather than random distribution by water and time. Stone faces that seem to track movement, as if the statues were built not just to represent pharaohs and gods, but to watch for something. Local traditions speak of a cursed city, a place that angered the gods and was dragged beneath the waves as punishment. Folklore is usually dismissed as metaphor, but folklore also has an uncomfortable habit of preserving information that official histories prefer to forget. The ship graveyards are perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Heracleon's mystery. 60 vessels of various sizes and origins, some Egyptian, some foreign, all apparently caught in the same catastrophic moment. Their cargo holds contain trade goods from across the known world, proof that Heracleion was not just connected to Mediterranean commerce, but central to it. Why would such an important hub completely disappear from historical consciousness? Why would every chronicler, every historian, every official record keeper in the ancient world seemingly agree to forget that Heracleion ever existed? Unless forgetting wasn't accidental. Unless someone, or some institution, had compelling reasons to erase Heracleion from official memory. Unless the city's destruction wasn't just a natural disaster, but an event so traumatic, so unexplainable, that acknowledging it threatened the foundations of pharaonic authority and religious certainty. The statues still standing on the seafloor aren't just archaeological artifacts, they're witnesses. Silent sentinels who've been keeping watch for 12 centuries, guardians of a secret that someone clearly wanted to stay buried beneath the Mediterranean. But the sea doesn't keep secrets forever. The water gives up its treasures slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. And with each new dive, each new survey, each new artifact brought to the surface, Heracleon's mystery deepens rather than resolves. What kind of civilization builds cities that can be completely erased from memory while remaining perfectly preserved in reality? What kind of disaster strikes so suddenly and completely that it leaves no time for evacuation, no opportunity for records, no chance for survival? And most unsettling of all, if Heracleion could vanish so thoroughly from history while remaining so perfectly preserved beneath the waves, what other lost cities lie waiting beneath the world's oceans? Their stories erased, but their stones still standing, their secrets still sealed in chambers that haven't been opened since the ancient world held its breath and forgot to exhale. The Mediterranean has many voices, but Heracleion speaks in the loudest silence of all. Story 4. Sea of Galilee, the monument that shouldn't exist. In 2003, sonar equipment scanning the bottom of the Sea of Galilee detected something that made archaeologists reach for stronger coffee, and engineers reach for calculators that could handle impossible numbers. Rising from the lakebed like a fossilized mountain, a massive cone-shaped structure sat in 40 feet of water, built from 60,000 tons of unhewn basalt boulders, measuring 70 meters across its base. To put that in perspective, this thing is twice the size of Stonehenge, built from stones that weigh as much as small buildings. Sitting at the bottom of a lake that wasn't supposed to be hiding monuments that dwarf Europe's most famous prehistoric sites. The structure doesn't whisper its mysteries, it screams them across 6,000 years of silence. Because that's the dating they're working with. Stone Age, Neolithic. The era when humanity was supposedly still figuring out agriculture and wondering whether fire was worth the trouble. Yet here sits a monument that required the kind of coordinated labor, engineering expertise, and sheer bloody-minded determination that we associate with much later civilizations. The basalt boulders aren't carved. They're not fitted together with mathematical precision. They're piled, stacked, arranged in a cone shape that suggests either ritualistic purpose or the world's most ambitious ancient art project. But the scale, the sheer overwhelming scale, transforms what might have been a simple stone cairn into something that challenges every assumption about Stone Age capabilities. 60,000 tons. Let that number dissolve in your mind like a slow-acting archaeological acid. 60,000 tons of stone, moved without wheels, without pulleys, without cranes, without any of the mechanical advantages that make massive construction projects feasible for modern civilizations. And moved to where? To the bottom of what was then a lake? Or to land that would later become the bottom of a lake when water levels rose? The positioning raises questions that don't have comfortable answers. Either the builders constructed this monument while standing knee-deep in water, which seems unlikely for a Stone Age project, or they built it on dry land that later submerged, which raises even more unsettling possibilities about ancient climate, hydrology, and the timeline of human development in the Levant. The structure sits alone. No accompanying settlements. No associated artifacts. No pottery shards, tool fragments, or burial sites that might provide context for who built this monument and why. It's as if someone dropped a massive stone monument into the Sea of Galilee without bothering to leave a forwarding address or explanation. The isolation is perhaps more unsettling than the scale. Monuments this size don't spring from nowhere. They require communities, leadership, resources, and generations of cultural continuity. They're built by civilizations, not by wandering bands of hunter-gatherers who suddenly decided to dedicate several decades to moving mountains one boulder at a time. Yet there's no evidence of the civilization that would have been necessary to create such a structure. No ancient cities in the region that could have supported the population needed for this kind of construction project. No archaeological layers that indicate sustained occupation by the kind of sophisticated society capable of organizing and executing such monumental work. The local archaeology is stubbornly unhelpful. The Sea of Galilee region has been extensively studied, mapped, and excavated. It's not an archaeological blank spot where surprises might be hiding. It's a well-documented area with a clear timeline of human habitation that doesn't include mysterious Stone Age megalith builders. But the monument sits there anyway, indifferent to archaeological timelines and theories of gradual cultural development. The construction method compounds the mystery. Unhewn basalt boulders suggests a building technique that prioritizes speed and efficiency over aesthetics. This wasn't built to impress, it was built to last. The cone shape is inherently stable, designed to withstand pressure from above and erosion from all sides. Whatever this structure was intended to do, it was meant to do it for a very long time. Theories proliferate like bacteria in archaeological culture medium. Burial cairn, they suggest. Ceremonial site, anchor point for ancient fishing operations. Territorial marker. Each theory more desperate than the last, to impose familiar categories on something that refuses to fit into comfortable explanations. The burial cairn theory collapses under the scale. 60,000 tons of stone for a grave suggests either a ruler of unimaginable importance or a very strange understanding of proportional response to death. The ceremonial site theory assumes religious practices that required monuments larger than cathedrals in an era when most religious expression involved small stone circles and painted caves. The territorial marker theory is perhaps the most unsettling because it implies competition. Territory is marked when there's something to defend against. Boundaries are established when there are neighbors who might not respect unmarked borders. What kind of Stone Age conflicts required monuments that could be seen from miles away, that communicated power and presence on a scale designed to intimidate civilizations? Sonar mapping reveals additional details that don't resolve the mystery, they deepen it. The structure's base shows evidence of deliberate shaping, of stones arranged not randomly but according to some organizing principle that remains opaque to modern analysis. There are patterns in the placement, rhythms in the arrangement that suggest planning, forethought, and possibly symbolic meaning. But symbols require a symbolic system. Patterns require cultural context. Planning requires a society sophisticated enough to conceive, design, and execute projects that span generations. None of which, according to standard archaeological timelines, should have existed in the Levant 6,000 years ago. The water itself compounds the preservation mystery. The Sea of Galilee is fed by the Jordan River and surrounded by geological activity that should have disturbed, displaced, or destroyed any structure sitting on the lakebed for millennia. Yet the monument remains intact, stable, apparently undisturbed by the countless earthquakes, floods, and seasonal water level changes that have reshaped the region repeatedly over 6,000 years. Local traditions offer no help, no folklore, no oral histories, no cultural memory of the monument or its builders. It exists in a complete vacuum of human remembrance, as if it was built by people who not only vanished, but who were systematically erased from every form of cultural transmission. The silence surrounding the structure is perhaps more unsettling than the structure itself, because silence, especially archaeological silence, usually indicates either very ancient origins or deliberate forgetting. And deliberate forgetting requires reasons. What kind of monument inspires amnesia? What kind of builders leave behind only stones? No stories, no explanations, no trace of their existence, except a massive pile of basalt that defies easy categorization. The Sea of Galilee keeps its secrets well, but this particular secret refuses to stay hidden, rising from the lakebed on sonar screens like a question mark made of stone, demanding answers that archaeology isn't equipped to provide. If these underwater mysteries fascinate you, consider subscribing. We're only scratching the surface of what lies hidden beneath the world's waters. Each discovery seems to suggest that human history is far more complex and mysterious than we've ever imagined, and the depths hold secrets that could reshape our understanding of the ancient world entirely. Story 5. Dwarka. When myths surface from the deep. There's a moment in archaeology when mythology stops being comforting folklore and starts being documentary evidence. When ancient texts stop reading like fairy tales and start reading like engineering reports. When the line between legend and geology disappears beneath 70 meters of Arabian seawater, leaving only stone walls, carved anchors, and the uncomfortable realization that someone's been telling the truth for 3,000 years. That moment arrived off the coast of Gujarat, India, when marine archaeologists descended into the Arabian Sea, expecting to find nothing more exciting than coral reefs and fishing debris. Instead, they found Dwarka, the legendary city of Krishna, described in exhaustive detail in the Mahabharata and Bhagavata Purana, complete with massive stone walls, sophisticated harbor installations, and urban planning that shouldn't exist in anything older than the Roman Empire. Except Dwarka predates Rome by a millennium, possibly longer. The sacred texts weren't subtle about Dwarka's magnificence. They described a city of impossible wealth and engineering sophistication, 900,000 palaces, artificial harbors that could accommodate the largest ships, defensive walls that rose from the sea itself, and urban infrastructure that made contemporary cities look like temporary camps. Archaeological orthodoxy dismissed these descriptions as religious hyperbole, the kind of mythological exaggeration that transforms ordinary ancient settlements into golden cities populated by gods and heroes. Until the underwater surveys started returning data that matched the textual descriptions with embarrassing precision. Stone walls, precisely as described, harbor installations exactly where the texts claimed they would be. Defensive structures positioned according to ancient blueprints that weren't supposed to be blueprints at all, just spiritual allegory. The mythology was mapping the seafloor with archaeological accuracy. The submersion timeline creates its own category of problems. According to the texts, Dwarka sank immediately after Krishna's departure from the earthly realm, a divine city that couldn't exist without divine presence, claimed by the sea as soon as its patron god moved on to other cosmic responsibilities. Geological dating suggests something more prosaic but no less mysterious. Post-Ice Age flooding, or tectonic subsidence, that swallowed a major urban center sometime between 1500 and 7500 before Common Era. The uncertainty in that timeline, 4,000 years of potential variance, indicates how little science understands about what actually happened to Dwarka and when. But the stone walls don't care about dating uncertainties. They rise from the seafloor in configurations that speak of deliberate urban planning, sophisticated engineering, and construction techniques that rival anything achieved by contemporary Bronze Age civilizations. These weren't primitive structures overwhelmed by natural forces. These were installations built to withstand oceanic conditions, to function as maritime infrastructure on a scale that suggests mastery of marine engineering. The carved stone anchors are perhaps the most unsettling discovery, not because carved anchors are particularly mysterious, but because their size and sophistication imply ships that don't fit comfortably into Bronze Age maritime timelines. The anchors suggest vessels of significant tonnage, ocean-going ships capable of carrying substantial cargo over long distances. What kind of Bronze Age civilization builds harbors for massive ships? What kind of ancient economy requires port facilities capable of handling heavy maritime traffic? The archaeological evidence points toward a level of international trade and naval sophistication that challenges fundamental assumptions about ancient technological capabilities. The fortification structures compound the mystery. These aren't simple defensive walls. They're marine installations, structures designed specifically to function in oceanic environments. The engineering required to build effective underwater fortifications, to create defensive positions that can withstand both military assault and constant wave action, represents a synthesis of military and marine engineering that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world. Yet there it sits, 70 meters down, as permanent and undeniable as the Arabian Sea itself. The pottery and artifacts recovered from the site span millennia, suggesting not a single settlement but a continuous urban tradition that somehow survived multiple submersion events. Some pieces date to periods when the site should have been underwater, implying either remarkable preservation conditions or construction techniques that allowed for continued habitation even as water levels rose around the city. Local oral traditions fill the gaps that archaeology can't explain. Stories of Dwarka's sinking that include details about tidal patterns, seasonal flooding, and engineering failures that sound less like mythology and more like eyewitness accounts, passed down through generations of coastal dwellers who watched the city disappear beneath the waves. The connection to Krishna adds layers of complexity that make rational analysis difficult. Because if the archaeological evidence is accurate, if Dwarka really was the sophisticated urban center described in the texts, then the Mahabharata and other sacred literature aren't just religious documents. They're historical sources with geographical precision that surpasses many contemporary accounts. But accepting Dwarka as historical evidence requires accepting implications that extend far beyond archaeology. It means acknowledging that Bronze Age India possessed urban planning capabilities, marine engineering expertise, and international trade networks that rival classical civilizations. It means recognizing that the technological timeline of human development might need significant revision. The underwater surveys continue to reveal new sections of the submerged city, new evidence of sophisticated construction and urban organization. Each discovery raises the stakes of the mystery higher, making the questions more uncomfortable and the answers more elusive. Why would a civilization build a city designed to function partially underwater? Why would ancient engineers develop marine construction techniques unless they expected to need them? Why would the texts describe Dwarka's sinking not as catastrophe but as transformation, as if submersion was part of the city's intended life cycle? The Arabian Sea doesn't give up its secrets easily. The murky waters, strong currents, and challenging diving conditions protect Dwarka's mysteries as effectively as any security system. But each expedition returns with new evidence that the legendary city was more than legend, more sophisticated than archaeology expected, and more mysterious than either science or religion is prepared to explain. In the silence beneath the waves, Dwarka waits. Not as myth, not as metaphor, but as stone and mortar and engineering sophistication that refuses to stay buried beneath either water or academic assumptions about ancient capabilities. The city that Krishna built, if Krishna existed, if the texts are historical, if archaeology is correctly interpreting what it finds, represents a challenge to everything we think we know about ancient civilization, not just in India, but globally. Because if Dwarka is real, if the texts are accurate, if Bronze Age civilizations possessed capabilities we've systematically underestimated, then the ocean floors of the world might be hiding the evidence of human sophistication we've never dared to imagine. But the waves keep washing over Dwarka, and the stone walls keep standing, and somewhere in that intersection of mythology and marine archaeology lies a truth that neither ancient texts nor modern science seems quite ready to acknowledge. The city beneath the Arabian Sea isn't just an archaeological site, it's a challenge to the comfortable assumption that human civilization developed in neat, predictable stages. It's evidence that the ancient world might have been stranger, more sophisticated, and more interconnected than we've ever been willing to admit. And if Dwarka is real, what other legendary cities might be waiting beneath the world's oceans, their stones still standing, their secrets still sealed, their stories still true? Story 6. Gulf of Cambay, the city that broke time. Some discoveries don't just rewrite history, they detonate it. In 2001, sonar equipment scanning the Gulf of Cambay off India's northwest coast returned readings so impossible that the archaeological community spent years arguing about whether to believe their own instruments. The data showed a city, not ruins, not scattered artifacts, but an organized urban settlement with grid-patterned streets, sophisticated drainage systems, and evidence of complex social organization. The dating made everything worse. 9,500 years old. That's not ancient. That's antediluvian. It places this underwater city in the Neolithic period, when human civilization was supposedly still figuring out agriculture and wondering whether settling down in one place might be worth the effort. Yet here lies evidence of urban planning that wouldn't look out of place in classical antiquity, preserved beneath 40 meters of Arabian Sea water, like a time capsule sealed by forces that don't appear in any geology textbook. The Gulf of Cambay discovery didn't just challenge archaeological timelines, it obliterated them. Because if the dating is accurate, this submerged city represents human urban organization that predates the earliest known civilizations by several millennia. It suggests that complex societies were designing cities, implementing infrastructure, and organizing large populations, while the rest of the world was supposedly still living in scattered hunting bands. The sonar mapping reveals a settlement that spans 10 square kilometers, roughly the size of Manhattan's financial district. But unlike Manhattan, this city was designed with geometric precision that makes modern urban planners look haphazard. The street layout follows a rigid grid system with intersections at precise right angles. The drainage infrastructure shows evidence of centralized planning and engineering expertise that shouldn't have existed when this city was allegedly constructed. The sophistication of the urban planning implies administrative capabilities that archaeology hasn't found evidence for in any other Neolithic site. Organizing a city requires census taking, resource allocation, construction coordination, and social hierarchies complex enough to implement and maintain large-scale public works projects. These are capabilities associated with much later civilizations, not with societies that were supposedly still learning how to domesticate grain. But the stones don't lie. They arrange themselves in patterns too deliberate for natural formation, too organized for accidental preservation. The underwater surveys reveal foundations, wall structures, and what appear to be public buildings positioned according to urban planning principles that wouldn't be codified for thousands of years after this city was allegedly built. The artifacts recovered from the site compound the temporal impossibility: pottery, beads, and worked materials that show evidence of specialized craftsmanship and possibly long-distance trade. The sophistication of these artifacts doesn't match the primitive material culture that archaeology associates with Neolithic India. They suggest a level of technological and artistic development that doesn't fit comfortably into established timelines of human cultural evolution. The preservation is suspiciously pristine for a site that's been underwater for nearly 10 millennia. The Gulf of Cambay isn't a gentle environment for archaeological preservation. It's subject to monsoon flooding, tidal action, and sediment deposition that should have buried, scattered, or destroyed any surface structures over the course of 9,500 years. Yet the city's layout remains clearly visible to sonar, suggesting either remarkable preservation conditions or construction techniques designed to withstand extended submersion. The submersion itself raises questions that geology struggles to answer. Post-Ice Age sea level rise could account for the flooding, but the timing doesn't align comfortably with known patterns of oceanic change. The rate of submersion implied by the site's preservation suggests a relatively sudden event rather than gradual flooding over centuries. But what kind of sudden geological event preserves urban infrastructure while submerging an entire city? No contemporary settlements in the region show evidence of the cultural sophistication necessary to build and maintain such an urban center. The archaeological landscape of 9,500-year-old India doesn't include other examples of complex urban organization, centralized planning, or the population density required to support a city of this scale. The Gulf of Cambay settlement exists in temporal and cultural isolation, as if it were dropped into the Neolithic period from a much later civilization. The absence of human remains in the underwater city adds another layer of mystery. No skeletons, no burial sites, no evidence of the population that would have been necessary to build and inhabit such a settlement. The city appears to have been abandoned cleanly, completely, and without the kind of material evidence that usually accompanies the end of urban centers. Local oral traditions offer tantalizing hints that mainstream archaeology prefers to ignore. Stories of ancient cities swallowed by the sea, of civilizations that angered the gods and were punished with catastrophic flooding. Folklore that describes technological capabilities and urban sophistication that match the archaeological evidence more closely than academic timelines. The dating controversy continues to rage through archaeological journals and conferences. Carbon dating of organic materials from the site consistently returns ages around 9,500 years. But these results are so disruptive to established chronologies that many archaeologists prefer to question the dating methods rather than accept the implications of the evidence. Because accepting the Gulf of Cambay city as genuinely 9,500 years old requires accepting that human civilization developed much earlier, much faster, and much more sophisticatedly than any current theory accounts for. It means acknowledging that the Neolithic period might have included capabilities and achievements that we've systematically underestimated or overlooked. The underwater city sprawls across the seafloor like a fossilized challenge to everything archaeology thinks it knows about human development. Each new survey reveals additional evidence of planning, organization, and construction expertise that doesn't belong in the Neolithic period according to every textbook and timeline currently used to teach human history. But the city doesn't care about textbooks. It sits beneath the Arabian Sea, indifferent to academic controversies and dating disputes, as permanent and undeniable as the water that covers it. The streets follow their geometric patterns. The drainage systems maintain their engineered precision, and the foundations anchor their structures exactly where ancient urban planners positioned them nearly 10 millennia ago. The Gulf of Cambay represents more than an archaeological anomaly. It represents a crack in the foundation of historical certainty. If this city is genuine, If the dating is accurate, if the evidence means what it appears to mean, then human civilization is older, more complex, and more mysterious than we've ever been willing to admit. And if one impossible city can hide beneath the waves for 9,500 years, what other temporal impossibilities might be waiting in the depths, challenging our assumptions about when, how, and why human civilization began to organize itself into the complex societies that eventually built pyramids, temples, and the modern world? The silence beneath the Gulf of Cambay isn't empty. It's pregnant with questions that archaeology isn't equipped to answer, and implications that history isn't prepared to accept. Story 7, Phanagoria, the Greek city that chose silence. There are ruins that whisper their stories through broken pottery and collapsed walls, and then there are ruins that scream their secrets through perfect preservation and inexplicable silence. Phanagoria, the ancient Greek metropolis that now lies partially submerged beneath the Black Sea's oxygen-starved waters, belongs firmly in the latter category. A city so well preserved, it feels like it was abandoned yesterday, yet so completely erased from historical memory that its rediscovery reads like archaeological science fiction. Founded in the 7th century before the Common Era by Greek colonists who apparently possessed either remarkable foresight or terrible luck, Phanagoria was once the largest city in the region, a thriving commercial hub that connected the Greek world to the Scythian territories and served as the eastern capital of the Bosporan kingdom. For over a millennium, it was one of the most important settlements on the northern Black Sea coast, a cosmopolitan center where Greek, Roman, and local cultures mingled in the kind of profitable harmony that builds monuments and fills treasuries. And then it vanished. Not gradually, not through conquest or plague or economic decline, but with the kind of thoroughness that suggests either supernatural intervention or very deliberate erasure. The underwater sections of Phanagoria tell a story that conventional archaeology struggles to read. Stone walls rise from the seafloor in configurations that show no evidence of gradual submersion, no signs of the slow flooding that should accompany natural sea level rise. Instead, the preservation suggests rapid, catastrophic inundation, the kind of sudden submersion that freezes a moment in time, rather than allowing for evacuation, salvage, or gradual abandonment. The Black Sea's unique chemistry compounds the mystery. The oxygen-poor waters that dominate the deeper regions create preservation conditions that function like a natural time capsule, protecting organic materials that would have decomposed centuries ago in normal marine environments. Wooden structures, fabric fragments, and even food remains emerge from Phanagoria's underwater districts in states of preservation that make archaeologists question their understanding of decay rates and material science. But preservation is only half the puzzle. The other half is the silence. For a city that dominated regional commerce for over 1,000 years, Phanagoria left remarkably few historical traces. No dramatic accounts of its destruction, no detailed records of its final days, no legends or oral traditions that explain how such a major urban center simply disappeared from the historical record. The silence feels deliberate, as if someone systematically erased Phanagoria from every chronicle, every trade record, every diplomatic correspondence that might have preserved its memory. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of a city that didn't decline, it stopped. Construction projects left unfinished, not from lack of resources, but from lack of time. Markets with goods still arranged on stone shelves, as if merchants stepped away for lunch and never returned. Harbor installations with ships' moorings still in place, waiting for vessels that will never arrive. The submersion pattern defies comfortable geological explanation. Portions of the city lie underwater while other sections remain on dry land, creating a preservation map that doesn't correspond to any known pattern of sea level change or tectonic subsidence. The flooding appears selective, targeting specific districts while leaving others untouched, as if the sea chose which parts of Phanagoria to claim and which to abandon. Local legends speak of a cursed city, a settlement that violated divine law and was punished with submersion. But the details of these legends are frustratingly vague, offering supernatural explanations without specifying the nature of the violation or the mechanism of punishment. The folklore feels like cultural memory that's been deliberately obscured, leaving only the emotional residue of catastrophe without the factual details that might explain what actually happened. The artifacts recovered from underwater Phanagoria include items that shouldn't have survived submersion, delicate ceramics with painted details intact, metal objects showing no signs of corrosion, Organic materials preserved as if they were buried in permafrost rather than submerged in seawater. The preservation conditions suggest an environment that's been sealed off from normal chemical processes, as if the underwater portions of the city exist in a different temporal framework. The amphory fields are perhaps the most unsettling discovery. Thousands of ceramic storage vessels scattered across the seafloor in patterns that suggest not random distribution by currents, but deliberate placement, according to some organizing principle that remains opaque to modern analysis. The amphorae appear to have been arranged in geometric configurations, possibly as part of some final ritual or ceremony before the city's abandonment. The absence of human remains throughout the underwater districts is conspicuous and unexplained. No skeletons, no burial sites, no evidence of the population that would have been necessary to maintain such a large urban center. Either the inhabitants evacuated completely before the submersion, leaving behind their possessions but taking no artifacts or records, or something else entirely happened to the people of Phanagoria. The architectural evidence suggests a city that was prepared for its own disappearance. Certain buildings show signs of deliberate dismantling, with valuable materials removed and architectural elements carefully preserved. Storage facilities appear to have been emptied systematically, with goods relocated rather than abandoned. These aren't the patterns of a city destroyed by natural disaster. They're the patterns of a city that organized its own departure. But organized departure to where? And why would a prosperous commercial center voluntarily abandon its position at one of the most strategic locations in the Black Sea region? What kind of threat or opportunity could motivate the complete evacuation of a city that had thrived for over a millennium? The underwater surveys continue to reveal new sections of submerged Phanagoria, each discovery raising more questions than it answers. The city appears to extend much farther beneath the Black Sea than surface archaeological evidence suggested, implying an urban complex of staggering size and sophistication that somehow managed to operate for centuries without leaving adequate historical records. Modern diving technology allows exploration of Phanagoria's underwater districts, but it doesn't allow understanding of what the exploration reveals. Each survey returns with evidence of sophisticated urban planning, advanced engineering, and cultural achievements that don't align with the historical silence surrounding the city's end. The oxygen-poor waters of the Black Sea preserve Phanagoria's secrets as effectively as they preserve its artifacts. In the chemical twilight of the deep waters, the submerged city waits with the patience of stone and the mystery of deliberate forgetting. What kind of civilization builds a major urban center and then erases it so thoroughly from historical memory that its rediscovery feels like archaeological resurrection? What kind of people possess the organizational capability to evacuate completely while leaving their city perfectly preserved for future discovery? And perhaps most unsettling, if Phanagoria could vanish so completely from history while remaining so perfectly preserved beneath the Black Sea, what other lost cities might be waiting in the depths? Their stories erased, but their stones still standing, their secrets still sealed in chambers that haven't been opened since the ancient world decided that some memories are too dangerous to preserve? Story 8. Azores Pyramid, the Atlantic's Impossible Monument. In 2013, sonar equipment scanning the seafloor near the Azores Islands detected something that shouldn't exist. A perfectly geometric pyramid rising 60 meters from the Atlantic Ocean floor, its precise angles and square base, suggesting human construction in a location where human construction makes no sense at all. The structure sits in water so deep and remote that accessing it requires specialized equipment and the kind of technical expertise usually reserved for deep space exploration. The Azores Pyramid doesn't whisper its mysteries, it broadcasts them across an ocean that wasn't supposed to be hiding monuments that rival Egypt's most famous constructions. The discovery location compounds every aspect of the mystery. The Azores sit in the middle of the Atlantic, isolated volcanic islands that rise from oceanic depths like geological afterthoughts. They're over 1,000 miles from the nearest continental landmass, positioned in waters that would have been prohibitively difficult to navigate for any ancient civilization. Yet here sits a structure that implies not just human presence, but human presence organized enough to move massive amounts of material and coordinate construction projects of monumental scale. The pyramid's geometry is disturbingly precise. Sonar mapping reveals right angles that don't occur in natural rock formations, symmetrical sides that suggest deliberate design, and overall proportions that match mathematical ratios found in pyramid construction, across multiple cultures. The structure's orientation aligns with cardinal directions in a way that implies astronomical knowledge and surveying capabilities that wouldn't be developed by maritime civilizations for millennia after this pyramid was allegedly constructed. But when was it constructed? The dating problem creates its own category of impossibility. If the pyramid was built above sea level and later submerged, its construction would have to predate the last ice age, placing it in a temporal framework that predates every known civilization capable of monumental construction. If it was built underwater, its construction represents engineering capabilities that exceed anything achieved by ancient cultures. The volcanic activity that characterizes the Azores region should have destroyed, buried, or significantly altered any artificial structure over geological timescales. The islands themselves are the result of relatively recent volcanic activity, with frequent eruptions and seismic events that reshape the landscape regularly. For a constructed pyramid to survive intact in such an unstable environment suggests either remarkably recent construction or construction techniques that account for and withstand geological volatility. The isolation factor eliminates most conventional explanations for the pyramid's existence. Ancient civilizations capable of monumental construction were land-based, dependent on agricultural surplus, population density, and resource extraction that requires proximity to continental landmasses. The Azores' position in the middle of the Atlantic makes them unsuitable for supporting the kind of complex society necessary to organize and execute massive construction projects. Yet the pyramid sits there anyway, indifferent to logistical impossibilities and archaeological timelines. The construction material appears to be basalt, consistent with the local volcanic geology but arranged in configurations that don't match natural formation patterns. Natural basalt structures form through cooling and crystallization processes that create distinctive geometric patterns, but these patterns don't include pyramid shapes with precise angles and symmetrical proportions. The material suggests local sourcing, but the arrangement suggests human intervention on a massive scale. The structure's purpose remains completely opaque. Pyramids serve various functions across different cultures: burial sites, ceremonial centers, astronomical observatories, territorial markers, but all of these purposes assume social contexts that don't exist in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. What kind of civilization builds monuments for purposes that require audiences, participants, or observers in locations where no audiences, participants, or observers could reasonably exist? The connection to Atlantis myths feels almost inevitable, but also fundamentally unsatisfying. The Azores pyramid doesn't match Plato's descriptions of Atlantean architecture, doesn't fit the geographical parameters outlined in classical sources, and doesn't correspond to the cultural characteristics attributed to legendary lost civilizations. If this pyramid is connected to Atlantis, it represents a version of that legend that bears little resemblance to any textual source. The depth and positioning of the pyramid create access challenges that limit investigation and verification. Deepwater archaeology requires specialized equipment, extensive resources, and weather conditions that allow for safe diving operations. The remote location means that comprehensive surveys are expensive, dangerous, and dependent on international cooperation in waters that don't fall under any single nation's archaeological jurisdiction. Each expedition to investigate the pyramid returns with more questions than answers. The structure appears to be solid rather than hollow, suggesting construction as a monument rather than as functional architecture. But monuments commemorate events, victories, or individuals that require cultural context to understand. What kind of event, victory, or individual would be commemorated with a massive pyramid in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? The geological surveys reveal additional anomalies in the surrounding seafloor. Sonar mapping detects other geometric irregularities near the pyramid, not additional structures, but patterns in the ocean bottom that suggest extensive modification of the natural landscape. The pyramid appears to be part of a larger complex of artificial modifications to the seafloor, implying construction activity on a scale that dwarfs the pyramid itself. The implications of the Azores pyramid's existence extend far beyond archaeology into fundamental questions about human maritime capabilities, prehistoric global connectivity, and the possibility of advanced civilizations operating in oceanic environments. If this pyramid is genuine human construction, it represents achievements in navigation, engineering, and resource management that don't fit into any established timeline of technological development. But the ocean doesn't preserve lies. The sonar readings are consistent across multiple surveys. The geometric precision is measurable and reproducible. The structure's existence is documented and verified by independent teams using different equipment and methodologies. The Azores pyramid stands, or sits depending on perspective, as a challenge to every comfortable assumption about ancient human capabilities and prehistoric global connectivity. It suggests that the Atlantic Ocean might have been highway rather than barrier for civilizations that possessed navigational and construction capabilities we've systematically underestimated. In the deep waters surrounding the Azores, currents that have circled the Atlantic for millennia flow past a pyramid that challenges everything we think we know about who built what, when, and why. The structure waits in the abyssal darkness, geometric and persistent, a monument to possibilities that archaeology isn't equipped to explain and oceanography isn't prepared to accept. What kind of civilization builds pyramids in the middle of oceans? What kind of people possess the technical capabilities to construct monuments in locations that wouldn't be accessible to maritime civilizations for thousands of years? And what other impossible structures might be waiting in the depths, hidden beneath miles of water and millennia of forgetting, challenging our assumptions about when, where, and how human civilization learned to reshape the world according to its own mysterious purposes? Story 9. Port Royal, the pirate city that God drowned. At precisely 11:43 a.m. on June 7th, 1692, the earth opened its mouth beneath Port Royal, Jamaica, and swallowed the wickedest city on earth in less time than it takes to say a prayer. 2/3 of the city disappeared into the Caribbean in minutes, taking with it thousands of lives, countless fortunes, and the most notorious pirate haven in the New World. What remained was an underwater graveyard so perfectly preserved that 3 centuries later, archaeologists can still walk through houses, read signs on tavern doors, and find pewter plates set for meals that were never finished. Port Royal wasn't just any city. It was the anti-city, the place where civilization's rules went to die. Built on a narrow spit of land guarding Kingston Harbor, it had grown into a sprawling metropolis of sin, where pirates laundered their plunder, merchants fenced stolen goods, and the local government operated on the principle that tax revenue from criminal activity was still tax revenue. By 1692, Port Royal housed over 10,000 residents in a space barely large enough for a modern shopping mall, creating population density that turned every street into a maze of taverns, brothels, gambling houses, and warehouses stuffed with the wealth of the Spanish Main. The city's reputation for debauchery wasn't folklore, it was municipal policy. Pirates were not just tolerated, but actively encouraged, granted letters of marque that transformed piracy into privateering and made Port Royal the unofficial capital of Caribbean buccaneering. The local economy ran on stolen Spanish gold, and the social hierarchy measured status in pieces of 8 and captured ships. It was a place where Henry Morgan could sack Panama and return to Port Royal for a knighthood and the lieutenant governorship of Jamaica. But all that wealth, all that wickedness, all that carefully cultivated lawlessness vanished in a geological instant that reads like biblical retribution delivered with seismic precision. The earthquake that destroyed Port Royal wasn't just another Caribbean tremor. It was a focused, devastating event that targeted the city with surgical accuracy while leaving the surrounding areas relatively undamaged. The main shock lasted less than 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes were sufficient to liquefy the sand and loose soil beneath Port Royal, transforming solid ground into quicksand that swallowed buildings, people, and entire city blocks. But here's where the physics gets strange. Liquefaction doesn't usually preserve structures. When earthquake vibrations turn solid soil into liquid, buildings collapse, foundations shift, and everything gets churned into debris. Yet the underwater archaeology of Port Royal reveals structures that sank intact, maintaining their architectural integrity even as they descended through liquefied sediment to rest on the harbor bottom. Houses still stand with their walls intact. Taverns preserve their internal layouts. Streets maintain their original configurations. The preservation is so complete that archaeologists have recovered pewter plates, still stacked in kitchen cupboards, wine bottles standing upright in cellars, and even pocket watches stopped at the exact moment of the earthquake. The timing feels deliberate. 11:43 a.m. on a Tuesday morning found Port Royal at peak activity. The markets were bustling, the taverns were full, the harbor was crowded with ships. If the earthquake had struck at dawn or midnight, many lives might have been spared. Instead, it hit when the maximum number of people were above ground, in vulnerable buildings, engaged in the daily business of running the wickedest city on earth. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that sound more like supernatural judgment than natural disaster. Witnesses reported that the sea rose and fell with unnatural regularity, that the earth opened and closed like a mouth, that buildings sank so quickly they disappeared before their occupants could escape. Some survivors claimed the ground moved in waves, rolling like the ocean surface, defying everything they understood about solid earth and stable foundations. The religious interpretation was immediate and universal. Port Royal's destruction was divine punishment for collective sin, God's wrath visited upon a city that had mocked Christian morality and celebrated criminality. Local clergy, many of whom had been complicit in the city's corruption, suddenly discovered prophetic voices and proclaimed the earthquake, a miracle of divine justice delivered with perfect timing and devastating accuracy. But divine justice doesn't usually preserve evidence so meticulously. The underwater Port Royal reads like a museum exhibit titled Life in a 17th Century Pirate City, complete with artifacts that shouldn't have survived 3 centuries of submersion. Lead shot still rattles in musket barrels. Ceramic pipes contain tobacco that archaeologists can identify by species. Leather goods preserve their original stitching patterns. The preservation conditions in Port Royal's underwater districts don't match normal marine archaeology expectations. The Caribbean isn't kind to organic materials, yet the submerged city contains wooden structures, fabric fragments, and paper documents that show minimal degradation. The preservation suggests environmental conditions that were sealed at the moment of submersion, as if the earthquake created an underwater time capsule rather than an archaeological scatterfield. The human remains tell stories that science struggles to explain. Skeletons found in houses show no evidence of panic or attempted escape. Bodies were discovered in sitting positions, lying in beds, standing in doorways as if death came so suddenly that there was no time for fear or flight. Some remains were found still wearing jewelry, still clutching personal possessions, still positioned as if life simply stopped rather than ending violently. The geological explanation for the earthquake remains frustratingly incomplete. Jamaica sits in a seismically active region, but the specific fault system responsible for the 1692 event has never been definitively identified. The earthquake's characteristics, its duration, intensity, and precise targeting of Port Royal, while sparing nearby areas, don't match typical patterns of Caribbean seismic activity. Modern seismic analysis suggests that the earthquake required a very specific set of geological conditions to produce the liquefaction effects that swallowed Port Royal. The city was built on loose sand and gravel fill that becomes unstable when subjected to sustained vibration, but this geological vulnerability was well known to local builders. Why would an entire city be constructed on foundations that were prone to catastrophic failure? Unless the failure wasn't accidental. Unless someone understood the geological vulnerabilities and chose to build Port Royal in a location where it could be destroyed quickly and completely if necessary. The city's strategic position guarding Kingston Harbor made it valuable enough to risk geological instability, but the risk proved prophetic rather than acceptable. The archaeological evidence suggests that Port Royal's destruction was total but not chaotic. The underwater ruins preserve the city's organization structure, maintain its street patterns, and protect its artifacts, as if the earthquake functioned more like a preservation mechanism than a destructive force. What kind of geological event destroys a city while simultaneously creating perfect conditions for its archaeological preservation? The silence following Port Royal's destruction is as significant as the destruction itself. The city was never rebuilt on its original site, never reoccupied by survivors, never reclaimed from the sea. The narrow spit of land that once supported 10,000 residents became a ghost peninsula, avoided by locals who whispered that the ground itself was cursed. 3 centuries later, Port Royal rests beneath Caribbean waters that keep its secrets as effectively as they preserve its artifacts. The underwater ruins sprawl across the harbor bottom like a fossilized moment of divine judgment, perfectly preserved evidence of what happens when wickedness builds cities in geological danger zones. But preservation raises its own questions. Why does the sea protect what God allegedly destroyed? Why do the underwater ruins of Port Royal remain so perfectly intact, while other Caribbean archaeological sites deteriorate rapidly in marine environments? And why does the city's destruction feel less like natural disaster and more like precision engineering designed to remove a problem while preserving evidence of its existence? The Caribbean keeps many secrets beneath its turquoise surface, but Port Royal might be the most unsettling. A city that was built to be destroyed, preserved to be studied, and remembered as proof that some places become too wicked for the earth to support. Story 10. Bahamas Stone Mysteries. The Caribbean's Lost Blueprint. 20 meters beneath the crystal-clear waters off Andros Island, limestone blocks arrange themselves in patterns that make marine geologists reach for stronger coffee, and underwater archaeologists question their career choices. These aren't random rock formations shaped by Caribbean currents. These are walls, foundations, and platform structures positioned with the kind of geometric precision that suggests human engineering in a location where human engineering makes no historical sense whatsoever. The Bahamas weren't supposed to be hiding architectural mysteries. They're limestone islands built on coral foundations, scattered across shallow Caribbean waters like geological afterthoughts. Their archaeology consists mainly of Lucayan Indian sites dating back a few centuries, not massive stone constructions that challenge fundamental assumptions about prehistoric maritime capabilities and ancient Atlantic navigation. Yet there they sit, massive limestone blocks weighing several tons each, arranged in linear formations that span hundreds of meters, positioned at precise angles that don't occur in natural geological processes. The structures include what appear to be harbor installations, defensive walls, ceremonial platforms, and residential foundations, the infrastructure of a sophisticated settlement that predates every known Caribbean civilization by millennia. The dating estimates place these structures at roughly 3000 BCE, making them contemporary with early dynastic Egypt and pre-dynastic Mesopotamia. But Egypt and Mesopotamia were continental civilizations with access to vast resources, large populations, and thousands of years of gradual technological development. The Bahamas in 3000 BCE were isolated coral islands, surrounded by hundreds of miles of open ocean, accessible only to maritime civilizations that weren't supposed to exist yet. The limestone itself compounds the mystery. The blocks show evidence of deliberate shaping, not the rough modifications that might result from natural wave action, but precise cuts, smooth surfaces, and corner joints that imply quarrying techniques and transportation methods. But where were these blocks quarried? The nearest limestone deposits capable of producing stones of this size and quality are hundreds of miles away, requiring ocean transport capabilities that Bronze Age civilizations weren't supposed to possess. The structural engineering visible in the underwater formations doesn't match any known Caribbean architectural tradition. The building techniques, stone placement methods, and overall design principles suggest influences from multiple cultures, possibly Mediterranean, possibly Atlantic, possibly something else entirely. These aren't structures built by local island populations adapting available materials. These are installations built by people who brought sophisticated construction knowledge from somewhere else. The preservation is suspiciously pristine for structures that have been underwater for 5 millennia. Caribbean waters are not gentle with archaeological remains. Hurricane activity, tidal action, and tropical storm systems should have scattered, buried, or destroyed surface structures repeatedly over the course of 50 years. Yet these limestone formations maintain their geometric precision and structural integrity as if they were submerged yesterday rather than during the Bronze Age. The positioning of the structures suggests they were built at sea level or above, then submerged by rising water levels sometime after construction. But the submersion timeline doesn't align comfortably with known patterns of post-Ice Age flooding in the Caribbean. The water level changes that would have been necessary to submerge these structures completely don't match geological evidence for regional oceanic rise during the relevant time period. The absence of associated archaeological material deepens the mystery. No pottery, no tools, no organic remains, no burial sites, none of the cultural debris that usually accumulates around long-term human settlements. The structures exist in complete isolation from any archaeological context that might explain who built them, when, why, or how they acquired the technical capabilities necessary for massive marine construction projects. Local oral traditions offer tantalizing hints that mainstream archaeology prefers to ignore. Lucayan legends speak of earlier peoples who came from across the Eastern Sea, who built stone cities on islands that later sank beneath the waves. These stories describe technological capabilities, large ships, stone-cutting tools, astronomical knowledge that don't fit with traditional timelines of Caribbean cultural development. The platform structures are perhaps the most intriguing elements of the underwater complex. These appear to be ceremonial or administrative installations, raised foundations that would have supported significant buildings. The platforms are oriented according to cardinal directions and show evidence of sophisticated surveying techniques that require both mathematical knowledge and astronomical observation capabilities. The defensive wall formations suggest a civilization that expected maritime threats, but threats from whom? If these structures really date to 3000 BCE, they predate every known aggressive maritime culture in the Atlantic region. What kind of Bronze Age conflicts required massive stone fortifications positioned to guard Caribbean sea lanes that weren't supposed to be significant transportation routes for thousands of years? The harbor installations are the most unsettling discovery. These include what appear to be docking facilities, mooring structures, and channel markers designed to accommodate large vessels. The engineering implies ships of significant tonnage, ocean-going vessels capable of carrying substantial cargo and passenger loads across hundreds of miles of open water. But Bronze Age maritime technology wasn't supposed to include ships capable of reliable Atlantic navigation. Modern underwater archaeology techniques allow detailed mapping and measurement of the Bahamas structures, but they don't allow understanding of what the measurements reveal. Each survey returns with more evidence of sophisticated planning, advanced construction techniques, and engineering capabilities that don't fit into established timelines of human technological development. The geometric precision of the stone placement defies explanation through natural processes. Limestone blocks don't arrange themselves in perfect right angles. Ocean currents don't create linear formations that span hundreds of meters. Tidal action doesn't produce platform structures with astronomical alignments. The arrangements require human intervention, but human intervention by people who possessed construction capabilities that shouldn't have existed in the prehistoric Caribbean. The scale of the construction project implies organizational capabilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about Bronze Age social structures. Moving and positioning stones of this size requires coordinated labor, specialized tools, and administrative systems capable of planning and executing complex engineering projects. These are characteristics associated with mature civilizations, not with the scattered island populations that archaeology assumes inhabited the prehistoric Bahamas. The connection to Atlantis theories feels inevitable but also problematic. The Bahamas structures don't match Plato's descriptions of Atlantean architecture, don't correspond to the geographical parameters outlined in classical sources, and don't align with the cultural characteristics attributed to legendary lost civilizations. If these structures are connected to Atlantis, they represent a version of that legend that bears no resemblance to any textual source. But the stones don't lie. They arrange themselves according to patterns that require explanation, maintain geometric relationships that demand understanding, and preserve engineering solutions that challenge every comfortable assumption about prehistoric human capabilities in the Atlantic region. The silence surrounding these structures is perhaps more unsettling than the structures themselves. No historical records, no oral traditions that provide adequate explanation, no archaeological context that makes sense of their existence. They sit beneath Caribbean waters like questions carved in limestone, waiting for answers that archaeology isn't equipped to provide. What kind of civilization builds massive stone installations in the middle of the Caribbean and then vanishes so completely that no trace remains except the installations themselves? What kind of people possess the maritime capabilities to construct harbor facilities in locations that wouldn't be accessible to ocean-going vessels for thousands of years? And what other impossible structures might be waiting beneath Caribbean waters, hidden by depth and time, challenging our assumptions about when, where, and how human civilization learned to reshape the world according to its own mysterious purposes? The turquoise waters of the Bahamas conceal more than tropical fish and coral reefs. They hide evidence of human achievement that doesn't fit into any timeline, doesn't match any known culture, and doesn't conform to any theory about prehistoric capabilities in the New World. But the limestone blocks remain, geometric and persistent, monuments to possibilities that underwater archaeology continues to document but can't yet explain. Story 11. Kekova, where staircases lead to nowhere. There's something particularly unsettling about staircases that descend into water. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. stone steps that once led to doorways, courtyards, and the daily business of ancient life, now leading only into the blue depths of the Mediterranean. Off Turkey's Lycian coast, the sunken city of Kekova offers visitors the chance to swim through neighborhoods, glide over rooftops, and follow staircases that vanish into underwater darkness, like fossilized promises that were never kept. Kekova wasn't always underwater. For centuries, it thrived as a prosperous Lycian settlement, perched on the Mediterranean coast where the mountains meet the sea. The Lycians built their cities with the confidence of people who understood stone, who trusted their engineering, and who expected their civilization to endure. They carved elaborate tombs into cliffsides, constructed theaters that could seat thousands, and developed urban infrastructure that supported complex societies for over a millennium. And then, sometime around the 4th century before the Common Era, Kekova began its slow descent into the sea. The submersion wasn't catastrophic. It was gradual, inexorable, allowing for evacuation but not for salvation. The city sank slowly enough for residents to remove their valuables and relocate their families, but quickly enough to preserve the architectural bones of an entire urban civilization. What remains is a ghost town in crystal-clear water, where you can swim through ancient streets and peer into houses that haven't hosted human inhabitants for over 2,000 years. The preservation is haunting in its completeness. Stone walls rise from the seafloor to within a few feet of the surface, creating underwater neighborhoods where fish swim through doorways and seagrass grows in what were once courtyards. Dock installations remain exactly where Lycian engineers positioned them, except now they serve as underwater sculptures rather than functional harbor infrastructure. But here's what makes Kekova particularly unnerving: the staircases. Everywhere you look, stone steps descend from dry land into the water, creating the impression that the Mediterranean has become a liquid basement, a flooded lower level of a multi-story city. The steps are perfectly preserved, geometrically precise, leading with architectural confidence toward destinations that now exist only in memory and saltwater. The geological explanation for Kekova's submersion remains frustratingly incomplete. Earthquakes, they suggest, gradual land subsidence, rising sea levels. All plausible, none sufficient to explain the peculiar pattern of submersion that affected Kekova while leaving nearby coastal settlements relatively untouched. The sinking appears selective, targeting specific areas while sparing others according to criteria that geology struggles to identify. The Lycian civilization wasn't supposed to be vulnerable to sudden, catastrophic change. They were master builders, people who constructed cities designed to withstand earthquakes, storms, and the various natural disasters that regularly reshape the Mediterranean coastline. Their architectural techniques included sophisticated foundations, flexible joint systems, and construction methods that absorbed and distributed seismic stress. Yet Kekova sank anyway. The timing of the submersion coincides uncomfortably with the broader collapse of Lycian independence and the region's incorporation into larger Mediterranean empires. Was Kekova's sinking connected to political upheaval, economic disruption, or military conflict? Or was it simply geological coincidence that the city began disappearing beneath the waves, just as Lycian civilization was disappearing beneath the weight of imperial conquest? The underwater archaeology reveals a city that was abandoned gradually but completely. No evidence of sudden disaster, no signs of catastrophic destruction, no indications that residents were forced to flee without their possessions. Instead, the submersion appears to have been anticipated, planned for, accepted as inevitable. The population relocated systematically, leaving behind only the stone infrastructure that was too heavy to move and too expensive to abandon. But where did they go? Lycian coastal settlements don't show evidence of sudden population increases during the period when Kekova was being abandoned. The refugees from the sinking city didn't simply move to neighboring towns. They seem to have dispersed completely, vanishing into the broader Mediterranean world without leaving clear traces of their resettlement. The dock structures present their own mysteries. These installations were designed for specific types of vessels, with mooring configurations that suggest ships of particular sizes and designs. But the harbor infrastructure at Kekova is more sophisticated than what would be necessary for a typical coastal fishing village. The engineering implies commercial activity, possibly international trade, conducted by a settlement that doesn't appear in any surviving records of Mediterranean commerce. Local legends speak of a cursed city, a settlement that violated divine law, and was punished with gradual submersion. But the details of these legends are maddeningly vague, offering supernatural explanations without specifying the nature of the violation or the mechanism of punishment. The folklore feels like cultural memory that's been deliberately obscured, leaving only the emotional residue of loss without the factual details that might explain what actually happened. The swimming experience at Kekova is profoundly disorienting. You can float above ancient streets, peer down into what were once cellars and storage rooms, and follow the geometric logic of urban planning that continues to function perfectly despite being 20 feet underwater. The city maintains its organizational structure even in submersion, as if Lycian urban planners designed their streets to work equally well on land or sea. The absence of human remains throughout the underwater city is both reassuring and mysterious. No skeletons, no burial sites, no evidence of the population that would have been necessary to build and maintain such an urban center. Either the inhabitants evacuated completely before the submersion, taking their dead with them, or the gradual sinking allowed for systematic relocation of both the living and the deceased. The architectural details that remain visible underwater demonstrate construction techniques that were more sophisticated than necessary for a provincial coastal town. The stone cutting, joint work, and overall engineering suggest a level of expertise and resource investment that implies either unusual wealth or unusual importance for a settlement of Kekova's apparent size. Modern conservation efforts treat underwater Kekova as an archaeological site rather than a natural wonder, recognizing that the submerged city represents cultural heritage that happens to be preserved in an aquatic environment. But conservation also raises questions about the relationship between preservation and accessibility. Should underwater cities remain underwater, protected by depth and difficulty? Or should they be raised, restored, and made available for traditional archaeological investigation? The Mediterranean continues to reveal Kekova's secrets slowly, grudgingly, allowing glimpses of Lycian life frozen in salt water and time. Each storm shifts sand and reveals new sections of the city. Each archaeological survey documents previously unknown structures, and each diving expedition returns with evidence that the underwater settlement was larger, more complex, and more mysterious than surface observations suggested. In the clear waters off the Turkish coast, Kekova waits with the patience of stone and the persistence of memory. Its staircases still descend toward destinations that exist only in water now. Its streets still connect neighborhoods where fish swim through doorways and currents flow through courtyards that once hosted human voices, human footsteps, and human lives. What kind of civilization builds cities so well that they function perfectly even when submerged? What kind of people accept the gradual sinking of their settlement and relocate without leaving records of where they went or why they left? And what other gradually sinking cities might be descending toward the seafloor right now? Their residents making plans for departure while their staircases slowly become underwater monuments to the impermanence of human settlement? Story 12. Lake Van, the fortress that drowned in salt. In the alkaline depths of Lake Van, Turkey's largest lake, stands a castle that shouldn't exist. Not because castles are rare, Turkey has plenty of those, but because this particular fortress sits completely submerged beneath waters so caustic they preserve organic matter like a natural formaldehyde bath, creating underwater archaeological conditions that make marine archaeologists question both chemistry and history. The castle dates to the Urartu kingdom, roughly 3,000 years old, built by a civilization that dominated the Armenian highlands when Egypt was at its imperial peak and Greece was still figuring out democracy. But the Urartians didn't build underwater castles. They built mountain fortresses, highland citadels, defensive installations positioned to control passes and valleys in some of the most rugged terrain in the ancient world. Yet here sits their handiwork, completely submerged in a lake that's more chemical solution than water body, preserved with the kind of detail that makes underwater exploration feel like walking through a flooded museum where every stone block is a perfectly maintained exhibit. Lake Van isn't just any body of water. It's a closed basin lake, with no outlet, fed by mountain streams and snowmelt that bring dissolved minerals but never carry them away. Over millennia, this has created water chemistry so extreme that very few organisms can survive in it. The lake is 4 times saltier than the ocean, with pH levels that would dissolve most organic materials in normal marine environments. Yet somehow, these same chemical conditions create preservation parameters that protect stone, metal, and other archaeological materials with remarkable efficiency. The discovery in 2017 wasn't accidental. Underwater archaeologists were specifically searching for submerged cultural sites in Lake Van, operating on local legends and geological theories about changing water levels. But finding a complete 3,000-year-old castle in pristine condition exceeded every expectation about what might be hiding beneath the lake's caustic surface. The castle spans hundreds of meters, with walls standing tall enough to create an underwater cityscape that divers describe as surreal and unsettling. Stone towers rise from the lake bed, like Gothic underwater architecture, their Urartu construction techniques perfectly visible despite 3 millennia of submersion. The preservation is so complete that archaeologists can study masonry details, construction joints, and architectural features with the kind of clarity usually available only in recently built structures. But how did a highland fortress end up underwater? The standard explanation involves rising lake levels, possibly due to climate change, tectonic activity, or changes in regional hydrology that gradually submerged what was once a dryland installation. But Lake Van's water chemistry complicates this simple narrative, because the extreme salinity and alkalinity that now preserve the castle would have made the area uninhabitable long before the water reached fortress level. The Urartians were sophisticated engineers who understood their environment. They built irrigation systems, managed agricultural resources, and positioned their settlements according to careful analysis of geological and hydrological conditions. It's difficult to imagine them constructing a major fortress in a location that was vulnerable to flooding by chemically hostile water, unless the castle wasn't built where it now sits. Unless it was constructed elsewhere and somehow transported, relocated, or repositioned through geological processes that don't appear in any standard explanations of regional tectonics. The alternative, that the Urartians deliberately built an underwater castle, requires engineering capabilities and purpose that don't align with anything known about ancient construction techniques or military strategy. The architectural evidence suggests a fortress designed for extended occupation and defense. The castle includes what appear to be living quarters, storage facilities, and defensive positions that would have required permanent garrisons and regular resupply. These aren't features you build for structures intended to be submerged. They're installations designed for long-term human habitation in terrestrial environments. The absence of human remains in the castle compounds the mystery. No skeletons, no burial sites, no evidence of the garrison that would have been necessary to maintain and defend such an installation. Either the fortress was evacuated completely before submersion, which implies advance warning of rising water levels, or something else entirely happened to its occupants. Local oral traditions speak of divine punishment, of kingdoms that angered the gods and saw their fortresses swallowed by rising lakes. But these stories provide supernatural explanations without geological specifics, leaving archaeologists to wonder whether the folklore preserves actual historical memory, or simply provides cultural frameworks for understanding inexplicable discoveries. The castle's construction techniques match known Urartu architectural traditions, confirming its cultural attribution but raising additional questions about the civilization's capabilities. The engineering required to build massive stone fortifications that could withstand both military assault and extended submersion in chemically extreme water represents a synthesis of military and chemical engineering that seems remarkably advanced for an ancient civilization. The lake's extreme chemistry creates preservation conditions that function like a time capsule, protecting the castle's details while simultaneously making the site dangerous and difficult to investigate. Diving in Lake Van requires specialized equipment and extensive safety protocols because the water's alkalinity can cause severe chemical burns and respiratory damage. The same conditions that preserve the castle also make it hazardous to explore. Modern underwater archaeology techniques allow detailed documentation of the submerged fortress, but they don't explain how a 3,000-year-old castle ended up in perfect condition beneath one of the world's most chemically hostile lakes. Each survey reveals new sections of the fortress, new evidence of Urartu construction sophistication, and new questions about the relationship between ancient engineering and extreme environmental conditions. The timing of the castle's submersion remains unclear. Archaeological evidence suggests the fortress was built during the height of Urartu power, when the kingdom controlled trade routes and commanded resources sufficient for major construction projects. But when did it sink? Climate records don't indicate dramatic changes in regional hydrology during the relevant time period, and geological surveys don't show evidence of tectonic events sufficient to alter Lake Van's water levels so dramatically. The strategic positioning of the castle, even in its current underwater location, suggests military planners who understood regional geography and defensive requirements. The fortress controls what would have been important approaches to Urartu territory, positioned to monitor and defend against potential invasions from multiple directions. But effective defensive positioning requires terrestrial rather than aquatic environments. Castles don't function well as military installations when they're completely submerged. The preservation extends beyond stone and metal to include organic materials that shouldn't survive in any underwater environment. Wood, fabric, and other perishable materials found in association with the castle show minimal degradation, suggesting that Lake Van's chemistry creates preservation conditions that exceed anything previously documented in underwater archaeology. What kind of civilization builds castles that can withstand millennia of submersion in chemically extreme environments? What kind of geological processes transport massive stone fortifications from terrestrial locations to underwater preservation sites? And what other impossible structures might be waiting beneath the world's most inhospitable lakes, protected by water chemistry that preserves while simultaneously preventing easy investigation? In the caustic depths of Lake Van, the Urartu Castle stands as a monument to questions that underwater archaeology can document but cannot answer. Its towers rise through alkaline water like stone fingers pointing toward a sky they'll never see again, guardians of secrets that neither chemistry nor history is equipped to explain. Story 13, Baiae, where Roman decadence drowned in luxury. There are ruins that tell stories of conquest and collapse, and then there are ruins that whisper tales of hedonism so extreme it seems to have angered the earth itself. Beneath the Bay of Naples, in waters that shimmer with volcanic heat and bubble with subterranean gases, lies Baiae, the ancient Roman resort city where emperors came to sin, senators came to scheme, and the wealthy came to indulge in pleasures so notorious that even Roman historians, who weren't easily shocked, described the city with a mixture of fascination and moral horror. Baiae wasn't just a city, it was a lifestyle brand, the ancient world's equivalent of Las Vegas crossed with a volcanic spa resort, and seasoned with enough political intrigue to make Byzantine court life look straightforward. Built around natural hot springs in the 1st century before the Common Era, it became the playground of choice for Roman nobility who wanted to escape the tedious business of governing an empire and focus on the more satisfying work of corrupting themselves in increasingly creative ways. The city's reputation for excess wasn't metaphorical, it was architectural. Villas that covered entire hillsides, thermal baths that could accommodate hundreds of bathers simultaneously, pleasure gardens designed for activities that required significant privacy, and banquet halls where Roman chroniclers claimed single dinner parties cost more than entire military campaigns. This was a place where wealthy Romans competed to see who could spend money in the most spectacular and morally questionable ways. And then it sank. Not gradually, not through centuries of decline, but decisively, catastrophically, with the kind of geological drama that reads like divine judgment delivered through volcanic processes. The same thermal activity that made Baiae attractive to Roman hedonists, the hot springs, the warm coastal waters, the mineral-rich volcanic soils, eventually betrayed the city through land subsidence, seismic activity, and possibly direct volcanic intervention. The underwater archaeology of Baiae reveals a city that was flash-frozen in the middle of its imperial decadence. Marble statues still stand in villa courtyards, their carved faces serene and untouched by time or salt water. Mosaic floors maintain their intricate patterns and vibrant colors, as if they were installed yesterday rather than 2 millennia ago. Thermal bath complexes preserve their sophisticated plumbing systems, complete with lead pipes and bronze fittings that show minimal corrosion, despite extended submersion. But the preservation itself is unsettling. Marine environments aren't kind to Roman construction materials. Salt water corrodes metal, undermines mortar, and gradually dissolves the limestone and marble that formed the basis of imperial architecture. Yet Baiae's underwater ruins show levels of preservation that seem to defy normal chemical processes, as if the volcanic activity that destroyed the city also created conditions that protected it from typical marine degradation. The timing of Baiae's submersion remains geologically mysterious. The city thrived through the early imperial period, reached its peak during the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius, and then began its descent into the Bay of Naples sometime during the later empire. But the geological events responsible for the submersion don't correspond clearly to known patterns of volcanic activity in the region. The Phlegraean Fields, the volcanic complex that includes modern Naples and the ancient Baiae site, have been active throughout recorded history. But the specific combination of land subsidence, seismic events, and thermal activity required to submerge an entire city doesn't match documented eruptions or earthquake sequences. The destruction appears to have been gradual enough to allow evacuation, but sudden enough to preserve structural details. The Roman historical record is suspiciously vague about Baiae's end. For a city that featured prominently in imperial chronicles, the place where Julius Caesar maintained a villa, where Cicero delivered some of his most scathing political attacks, where emperors conducted both diplomacy and debauchery, the silence surrounding its destruction feels deliberately incomplete. Perhaps the silence was intentional. Baiae represented everything that later Christian moralists found objectionable about pagan Roman culture: sexual excess, political corruption, conspicuous consumption, and spiritual emptiness dressed up as sophisticated entertainment. The city's submersion could be interpreted as divine judgment, making its destruction a convenient moral lesson rather than a geological tragedy worth documenting in detail. The underwater villa complexes tell stories that Roman historians preferred not to preserve. These weren't just residential buildings. They were entertainment complexes designed for activities that required elaborate facilities, extensive privacy, and significant financial resources. The architecture includes features that modern archaeologists describe diplomatically as specialized entertainment spaces, rooms whose purposes become clear only when you consider them in the context of Roman elite culture at its most unrestrained. The thermal bath installations preserve evidence of engineering sophistication that rivals modern spa technology. The Romans understood geothermal energy, hydraulic engineering, and architectural climate control in ways that allowed them to create environments of almost supernatural luxury. The baths at Baiae included temperature-controlled pools, steam rooms, massage facilities, and relaxation areas that transformed bathing from hygiene into hedonistic performance art. But luxury has its geological limits. The same volcanic forces that provided Baiae with its attractive thermal features also made the area unstable, prone to earthquakes, and vulnerable to land subsidence. Building a resort city on active volcanic terrain might have seemed acceptable when the benefits included natural hot springs and mineral-rich soils, but the long-term costs proved catastrophic. The statuary that remains standing in underwater Baiae includes portraits of emperors, gods, and wealthy private citizens. Their carved features preserved with a clarity that makes the submerged city feel like a flooded museum. But the expressions on these marble faces seem oddly appropriate for their underwater setting, serene, resigned, almost expectant, as if the sculptors anticipated that their subjects would eventually be contemplating eternity from beneath the waves. Local legends speak of a cursed city, a settlement that violated divine law through excessive indulgence and was punished with submersion. The folklore includes specific details about moral violations, divine warnings, and the gradual sinking that followed imperial excess. But these stories might preserve actual historical memory, rather than simply providing supernatural explanations for geological events. The modern Bay of Naples continues to experience volcanic activity, seismic events, and thermal phenomena that make the region both attractive and dangerous. The same geological forces that destroyed ancient Baiae continue to operate, raising questions about the wisdom of building contemporary cities in locations where imperial Roman resort towns couldn't survive long-term environmental pressures. The diving experience at underwater Baiae is profoundly disorienting. You can swim through villa courtyards, glide over mosaic floors, and peer into thermal baths that once hosted the most powerful people in the ancient world. The preservation is so complete that you expect to encounter Roman bathers, imperial guests, or at least the ghosts of a civilization that measured success in terms of how spectacularly it could violate every principle of moderation and restraint. The Bay of Naples keeps many secrets beneath its thermally active waters, but Baiae might be the most poignant, a city that achieved everything the ancient world associated with sophisticated luxury, only to discover that geological forces don't respect imperial authority, volcanic terrain doesn't accommodate permanent construction, and sometimes the Earth itself decides that certain kinds of excess deserve to be preserved only as underwater memories. What kind of civilization builds resort cities on active volcanic terrain? What kind of people create architectural monuments to hedonism in locations where thermal activity makes long-term habitation impossible? And what other luxury cities might be waiting beneath the world's waters, their marble statues still standing, their moral lessons still preserved in salt water and time? Story 14. Ionian Sea, the columns that challenge history. In 2016, beneath the clear blue waters off Zakynthos in the Ionian Sea, divers encountered something that shouldn't exist. Perfect stone columns rising from the seafloor like underwater temple ruins, their surfaces carved with geometric precision that suggests human craftsmanship, in a location where human craftsmanship makes no historical sense whatsoever. The formations include what appear to be foundations, paved surfaces, and architectural elements arranged in patterns too deliberate for natural processes, too ancient for known civilizations. The structures sit in water shallow enough for recreational diving, but deep enough to have been submerged for millennia, creating an archaeological timeline that challenges every comfortable assumption about prehistoric Mediterranean maritime capabilities. These aren't scattered stones rearranged by currents. These are organized installations that maintain geometric relationships across hundreds of square meters of seafloor. The column formations are the most unsettling discovery. Perfect cylinders of carved stone, some over 2 meters tall, positioned at regular intervals that suggest architectural planning rather than geological accident. The columns show evidence of deliberate shaping, with surfaces that display tool marks, decorative elements, and structural modifications that don't occur in natural rock formations. But who carved them? And when? The Ionian Sea off Zakynthos wasn't supposed to be hiding prehistoric architectural mysteries. The archaeological record for the region includes classical Greek settlements, Roman installations, and medieval structures, but nothing that predates the historical period by the millennia that would be necessary to explain these submerged formations through gradual sea level rise. The geometric precision of the stone arrangements defies explanation through marine geology. Ocean currents don't create right angles. Tidal action doesn't produce linear formations. Wave energy doesn't organize random stones into architectural patterns that maintain structural relationships across large areas. The arrangements require human intervention, but human intervention by people who possessed construction capabilities that don't fit into established timelines of Mediterranean technological development. The dating problem creates its own category of impossibility. If these structures were built above sea level and later submerged, their construction would have to predate the last significant sea level changes in the region, placing them thousands of years before any known Mediterranean civilization capable of monumental stone construction. If they were built underwater, their construction represents engineering achievements that exceed anything accomplished by ancient maritime cultures. The preservation is suspiciously pristine for structures that have been underwater for extended periods. The Ionian Sea is subject to seismic activity, storm systems, and tidal forces that should have displaced, buried, or destroyed surface structures over geological timescales. Yet these formations maintain their geometric precision and architectural integrity as if they were submerged recently, rather than during prehistoric periods. The paved surfaces present additional mysteries. Large stone slabs arranged in patterns that resemble plaza floors, ceremonial platforms, or foundation systems for structures that no longer exist. The paving stones are fitted together with joints that show evidence of deliberate cutting and placement, creating surface areas that span dozens of square meters with geometric regularity that doesn't occur naturally. The absence of associated archaeological material compounds the mystery. No pottery, no tools, no metal objects, no organic remains, none of the cultural debris that usually accumulates around human settlements. The structures exist in complete isolation from any archaeological context that might explain their origins, purpose, or the technological capabilities of their builders. Local maritime traditions offer hints that mainstream archaeology prefers to dismiss. Fishermen's stories about underwater ruins, navigational landmarks that don't appear on modern charts, and areas where nets snag on stone formations that shouldn't exist. These accounts describe discoveries that match the recently documented structures, suggesting that the underwater installations have been known to local populations for much longer than official archaeological recognition. The structural engineering visible in the formations suggests construction techniques that don't match any known Mediterranean architectural tradition. The stone cutting methods, assembly procedures, and overall design principles appear to represent influences from multiple cultures or from a single culture that possess technological capabilities not documented in any historical record. The depth and positioning of the structures indicate they were built at or above sea level, then submerged by rising water levels or land subsidence. But the submersion timeline doesn't align with known patterns of post-glacial flooding or tectonic activity in the Ionian Sea region. The geological changes necessary to submerge these structures completely don't match evidence for regional oceanic or seismic events during the relevant time periods. The ceremonial platform hypothesis is particularly intriguing. Some of the formations resemble ritual installations, with central raised areas surrounded by carved elements that might have served religious or astronomical purposes. But ceremonial platforms require communities to use them, and communities require archaeological evidence of habitation, resource extraction, and cultural activity that simply doesn't exist in the surrounding area. Scientific analysis of the stone material confirms local geological origin, ruling out theories about transported monuments or exotic construction materials. The columns and paved surfaces were carved from limestone that occurs naturally in the region, but the quarrying and shaping techniques exceed anything documented for prehistoric Mediterranean cultures. The underwater surveys reveal additional geometric anomalies scattered across the seafloor near the main formations. These include linear arrangements of stones, circular patterns, and what appear to be channel systems that might have served drainage or water management functions. The extended distribution suggests a complex of related structures rather than isolated installations. Modern marine archaeology techniques allow detailed mapping and measurement of the Ionian Sea structures, but they don't provide understanding of what the measurements mean. Each survey documents more evidence of sophisticated planning, advanced construction capabilities, and engineering solutions that don't fit into established theories about prehistoric human achievement in the Mediterranean region. The tourism implications of the discovery create additional complications for archaeological investigation. Underwater ruins attract recreational divers, but increased visitation threatens the integrity of structures that have survived underwater for millennia. The need to balance public access with preservation requirements limits opportunities for comprehensive scientific study. The silence surrounding these structures in historical records feels particularly significant. No ancient texts mention massive stone installations off Zakynthos. No classical authors describe underwater ruins in the Ionian Sea. No medieval chronicles reference submerged architectural wonders. The complete absence of documentary evidence suggests either very ancient origins or very deliberate forgetting. What kind of prehistoric culture builds monumental stone installations in locations that become underwater archaeological sites? What kind of engineering capabilities allow for precise stone cutting and massive construction projects without leaving archaeological evidence of the society that possessed these capabilities? And what other impossible structures might be waiting beneath Mediterranean waters, hidden by depth and time, challenging assumptions about prehistoric human achievement in one of the world's most archaeologically documented regions? The Ionian Sea keeps its secrets well, but these particular secrets refuse to stay hidden beneath the waves, rising from the seafloor in geometric arrangements that demand explanations archaeology isn't equipped to provide. Story 15. Olus, the Minoan city that time abandoned. There are archaeological sites that reveal their secrets gradually, through careful excavation and patient analysis. And then there are sites that expose themselves completely, lying half-submerged in shallow water, like ancient urban planning projects interrupted by geological drama. Olus, the Minoan settlement on Crete's northeast coast, belongs to the latter category, a city so perfectly preserved in its partial submersion that you can walk through ancient streets that transition seamlessly from dry land to underwater neighborhoods, as if the Mediterranean decided to claim only half the city and leave the rest as a lesson in temporal architecture. The Minoans weren't supposed to leave cities lying around in shallow water. They were Bronze Age maritime masters, people who understood the sea well enough to build the first European naval civilization, who created palace complexes that wouldn't look out of place in classical antiquity, and who developed trade networks that connected the Mediterranean from Egypt to Spain. They were sophisticated enough to predict and prevent the kind of gradual submersion that slowly claimed Olus over several centuries. Yet here lies their handiwork, half-drowned and perfectly visible, creating an archaeological experience that feels more like time travel than traditional excavation. The submersion pattern at Olus defies comfortable geological explanation. The city sank slowly enough to allow evacuation. No human remains, no evidence of catastrophic destruction, but selectively enough to preserve architectural details with museum-quality clarity. Stone walls rise from water that's shallow enough to wade through, creating neighborhoods where you can follow ancient street patterns from dry land into the Mediterranean without losing the urban logic that organized Minoan daily life. The harbor installations are perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the site. These weren't primitive fishing village docks. They were sophisticated port facilities designed to accommodate large vessels, with stone quays, mooring systems, and warehouse foundations that suggest commercial activity on a scale that required international trade connections. But the harbor structures now sit in water too shallow for any vessel larger than a fishing boat, creating a monument to maritime capabilities that exceed the site's current accessibility. The preservation extends beyond stone architecture to include details that shouldn't survive centuries of partial submersion. Carved decorative elements maintain their crisp edges. Joint work between stone blocks shows minimal degradation, and even delicate architectural features like column capitals preserve their ornamental details as if they were carved yesterday rather than over 2 millennia ago. The timing of Olaus's abandonment coincides uncomfortably with the broader collapse of Minoan civilization, but the city's submersion appears to have been gradual rather than catastrophic. This creates a temporal puzzle. If the Minoans possessed the engineering expertise to build sophisticated harbor installations and urban infrastructure, why couldn't they prevent or adapt to the rising water levels that eventually claimed their city? The archaeological evidence suggests that Olus wasn't abandoned suddenly, it was evacuated systematically. The underwater sections contain no personal possessions, no valuable artifacts, no evidence of hasty departure. Instead, the submersion appears to have been anticipated and planned for, with residents relocating gradually as water levels rose around their neighborhoods. But planned relocation raises its own questions. Where did the population of Olus go? Other Minoan sites don't show evidence of sudden population increases during the period when Olus was being abandoned. The refugees from the sinking city seem to have dispersed completely, vanishing into the broader Mediterranean world without leaving clear archaeological traces of their resettlement. The street patterns visible both above and below water demonstrate urban planning sophistication that exceeds what archaeologists typically associate with Bronze Age settlements. The roads follow geometric principles, intersect at calculated angles, and connect public spaces according to design principles that suggest centralized planning and administrative coordination. This wasn't a village that grew organically, it was a city that was designed. The underwater neighborhoods preserve evidence of social stratification that tells stories about Minoan society. Larger houses with more elaborate architecture cluster in certain areas, while smaller, simpler buildings group together in what appear to be working-class districts. The urban organization reflects economic hierarchies and social structures that were more complex than traditional models of Bronze Age civilization typically acknowledge. Local legends speak of a cursed city, a settlement that violated sacred laws and was punished with gradual submersion by the sea. But unlike many folklore explanations for archaeological mysteries, these stories include specific geographical details that match the actual submersion pattern of Olus. The legends describe rising water levels, systematic evacuation, and the deliberate abandonment of a city that could no longer resist the advancing Mediterranean. The absence of dramatic destruction marks distinguishes Olus from other Minoan sites that show evidence of earthquakes, fires, or military conquest. The city appears to have ended not with catastrophe but with resignation, a gradual acceptance that the sea's claim on the settlement was inevitable and irresistible. The modern experience of visiting Olus is profoundly disorienting because the transition from terrestrial to underwater archaeology happens gradually, allowing visitors to follow ancient streets as they descend beneath the Mediterranean's surface. You can walk through Minoan neighborhoods that function perfectly as urban spaces, despite being partially submerged, creating an impression that the city is simply taking a very long bath. The marine life that now inhabits underwater Olus adds a surreal dimension to the archaeological experience. Fish swim through doorways that once framed human activities, seagrass grows in courtyards that once hosted Minoan family life, and crabs scuttle across mosaic floors that once supported Bronze Age footsteps. The integration of marine and archaeological environments creates a living museum where ancient urban planning provides structure for contemporary aquatic ecosystems. The tourism industry around Olus markets the site as the Sunken City, but this designation misses the fundamental strangeness of a place that isn't fully sunken, it's transitional, existing simultaneously in terrestrial and marine environments. The partial submersion creates archaeological conditions that don't exist anywhere else in the Mediterranean, making Olus unique not just historically, but experientially. Modern conservation efforts face unusual challenges because the site exists in both marine and terrestrial environments simultaneously. Traditional archaeological preservation techniques don't account for structures that are alternately exposed to air and submerged in salt water, depending on tidal conditions. The dual environment creates preservation problems that require innovative solutions combining terrestrial and underwater conservation methods. The scientific studies of Olus continue to reveal evidence that Minoan civilization was more sophisticated, more resilient, and more adaptable than traditional Bronze Age models suggest. The city's gradual abandonment demonstrates organizational capabilities and social coordination that allowed for systematic evacuation and planned relocation rather than catastrophic collapse. But systematic evacuation to where? The mystery of Olus isn't just why it sank. It's where its people went when they recognized that their city could no longer remain above water. The absence of archaeological evidence for large-scale Minoan resettlement suggests either very effective integration into other communities or relocation to areas that haven't been identified by modern archaeology. The Mediterranean continues to reveal new sections of underwater Olus as tidal patterns and seasonal weather conditions expose previously hidden architectural features. Each revelation adds to the evidence that Minoan urban planning was more sophisticated than previously understood, but also deepens the mystery of how such a well-organized civilization could simply vanish without leaving clear traces of where its people went or why they couldn't prevent their cities from sinking into the sea. In the shallow waters off Crete's northeast coast, Olus waits with half its architecture above water and half below, a monument to the impermanence of human settlement and the persistence of stone construction. Its streets still connect neighborhoods, even when those neighborhoods exist in different environmental conditions. Its urban planning still functions, even when half the city requires diving equipment to explore. What kind of civilization builds cities so well that they continue to function as urban spaces even when partially submerged? What kind of people possess the organizational capability to evacuate systematically while leaving their architectural achievements intact for future discovery? And what other half-sunken cities might be waiting in shallow waters around the world, their urban planning bridging terrestrial and marine environments, their secrets preserved in the intersection between land and sea? Story 16, Canopus, where Egyptian gods drowned in silence. 10 meters beneath the murky waters of Abu Qir Bay, colossal granite statues of Egyptian gods stand in perfect formation, their carved eyes gazing into an eternity of salt water and Mediterranean silence. They are guardians of Canopus, the Ptolemaic city that once rivaled Alexandria as a center of learning, commerce, and religious authority, before it vanished beneath the waves so completely that its rediscovery in the 1990s felt less like archaeology and more like resurrection. Canopus wasn't just another ancient Egyptian settlement, it was a sacred city, home to temples that drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world, a place where Greek philosophy mingled with Egyptian mysticism, and Roman political power borrowed legitimacy from pharaonic religious tradition. For over 7 centuries, it served as a cultural bridge between the classical and ancient worlds, a cosmopolitan center where intellectual and spiritual currents from 3 continents merged in the kind of sophisticated synthesis that creates lasting civilizations. And then it sank without explanation, without warning, without leaving any record of why one of the most important cities in the eastern Mediterranean simply disappeared beneath the waves. The underwater archaeology of Canopus reads like a museum catalog of impossibilities. Granite statues weighing several tons stand upright on the seafloor, their positions suggesting deliberate placement, rather than random distribution by water and time. Temple foundations maintain their geometric precision, despite centuries of submersion. Canal systems preserve their engineered proportions, as if they were designed to function underwater, rather than having been accidentally submerged. The preservation defies every expectation about what happens to Egyptian monuments when they encounter salt water and marine chemistry. Granite should weather, limestone should dissolve, and metal should corrode when exposed to oceanic conditions for extended periods. Yet the artifacts recovered from underwater Canopus show minimal degradation, maintaining surface details and structural integrity that suggest preservation conditions more consistent with desert burial than Mediterranean submersion. The colossal statuary is particularly unsettling. These aren't small decorative pieces, they're massive representations of gods and pharaohs, carved from single blocks of granite and positioned according to religious and astronomical principles that required sophisticated planning and substantial resources. Moving and installing such monuments demands engineering capabilities, organizational coordination, and cultural continuity that spans generations. But who moved them underwater? And why do they stand in perfect formation on the sea floor, as if they were arranged for underwater ceremonies, rather than having fallen randomly when the city sank? The timing of Canopus's submersion remains geologically mysterious. The city thrived during the Ptolemaic period, reached its intellectual peak during the early Roman Empire, and then began its descent into Abu Qir Bay sometime during the later imperial centuries. But the geological events responsible for the submersion don't correspond to documented patterns of seismic activity, volcanic events, or sea level change in the eastern Mediterranean. The Nile Delta, where Canopus was located, is geologically unstable, subject to land subsidence, earthquake activity, and hydrological changes that can alter local topography over relatively short time periods. But the specific combination of geological factors required to submerge an entire city without destroying its architectural integrity doesn't match any known pattern of delta instability or natural disaster. The historical silence surrounding Canopus's destruction is as mysterious as the preservation of its ruins. For a city that featured prominently in classical literature, the place where Menelaus and Helen allegedly landed after their return from Troy, where Ptolemaic scholars conducted advanced astronomical research, where Roman emperors came to consult with Egyptian priests, the absence of detailed accounts describing its end feels deliberately incomplete. Perhaps the silence was politically motivated. Canopus represented a synthesis of Greek, Roman, and Egyptian cultural elements that later Christian authorities found problematic. The city's temples practiced religious traditions that were incompatible with emerging Christian orthodoxy, and its intellectual traditions preserved knowledge that ecclesiastical authorities preferred to suppress. The submersion of Canopus could be interpreted as divine judgment, making its destruction a convenient moral lesson rather than a geological tragedy worth preserving in historical memory. The underwater temple complexes preserve evidence of religious practices that combined Egyptian ritual traditions with Greek philosophical methods and Roman administrative efficiency. These weren't simple religious buildings. They were research institutions, libraries, and centers of learning that integrated spiritual practice with scientific investigation in ways that wouldn't be replicated until the Renaissance. The engineering required to build and maintain such institutions represents achievements in architecture, hydraulics, and urban planning that rival anything accomplished by contemporary civilizations. The temple foundations include sophisticated drainage systems, climate control mechanisms, and structural supports designed to withstand both seismic activity and flooding. Ironically, everything except the catastrophic submersion that eventually claimed the entire city. The canal systems that connected Canopus to the Nile and the Mediterranean preserve evidence of hydraulic engineering that was more sophisticated than necessary for a typical commercial port. The channels show evidence of deliberate depth control, current management, and possibly tidal regulation, engineering solutions that suggest the city's builders understood marine dynamics and river hydraulics at a level that exceeded practical requirements for normal trade and transportation. Local maritime traditions speak of underwater temples, submerged statues, and areas where fishing nets snag on stone formations that rise from the bay's muddy bottom. These accounts describe discoveries that match the documented archaeological sites, suggesting that Canopus's underwater ruins have been known to local populations for much longer than official recognition by marine archaeologists. The artifact distribution across the submerged city doesn't match patterns typically associated with natural disasters or gradual abandonment. Instead, the underwater archaeology suggests systematic organization, as if valuable objects were deliberately positioned and protected before the submersion occurred. This raises uncomfortable questions about whether Canopus's sinking was truly unexpected, or whether the city's final inhabitants had advance warning of impending catastrophe. The modern rediscovery of Canopus has revealed a city that was larger, more sophisticated, and more culturally significant than surviving historical records suggested. Each underwater survey documents previously unknown temple complexes, residential districts, and administrative buildings that expand our understanding of Ptolemaic urban planning and Egyptian religious architecture. But expansion of knowledge also expands the mystery. If Canopus was as important as the archaeological evidence suggests, why did its destruction leave so little trace in historical records? If the city possessed the engineering capabilities evident in its underwater ruins, why couldn't its builders prevent or adapt to the geological changes that led to submersion? The diving experience at Canopus is profoundly disorienting because the underwater ruins preserve the spatial relationships and architectural logic of an active city. You can swim along ancient processional routes, peer into temple chambers that once hosted sacred ceremonies, and encounter granite statues that seem to be waiting for worshippers who will never arrive. The Mediterranean continues to protect Canopus's secrets as effectively as it preserves its monuments. In the murky waters of Abu Qir Bay, Egyptian gods stand eternal watch over a city that achieved everything the ancient world associated with learning, spirituality, and cultural synthesis, only to discover that neither divine protection nor human knowledge could prevent its disappearance beneath waves that transformed temples into underwater museums and gods into marine sentinels. What kind of catastrophe submerges entire cities while leaving their monuments standing in perfect formation? What kind of geological event preserves granite statuary while erasing historical memory? And what other sacred cities might be waiting beneath the world's waters, their gods still standing guard, their secrets still sealed in chambers that haven't been opened since the ancient world decided that some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve above the surface? Story 17, Gulf of Khambhat, the fortress that time forgot. Beyond the main Gulf of Cambay discovery, deeper beneath the Arabian Sea's restless waters, lie additional ruins that make the already impossible timeline of ancient Indian Ocean civilizations even more uncomfortable for archaeologists to contemplate. These are the Gulf of Khambhat ruins, massive stone blocks, defensive fortifications, and what appear to be harbor installations dated to roughly 7,000 years ago, preserved in 40 meters of water like architectural evidence that someone was building sophisticated maritime cities when the rest of the world was supposedly still figuring out agriculture. The Khambhat ruins don't whisper their mysteries. They proclaim them through megalithic stone construction that rivals anything achieved by classical civilizations, positioned beneath water depths that place them in the Neolithic period, challenging every comfortable assumption about the development of human urban civilization and maritime engineering capabilities. The massive stone blocks are the most immediately unsettling discovery. These aren't modest building materials, they're megalithic construction elements weighing several tons each, cut and shaped with precision that indicates sophisticated quarrying techniques and transportation capabilities. The blocks are arranged in formations that suggest defensive walls, foundation systems, and possibly ceremonial platforms, creating underwater architectural complexes that span hundreds of square meters. But 7,000-year-old megalithic construction doesn't fit into established timelines of technological development. The precision stone cutting, massive scale construction, and coordinated urban planning evident in the Khambhat ruins represent capabilities that archaeology traditionally associates with much later civilizations, Bronze Age societies with metal tools, complex social hierarchies, and accumulated generations of engineering experience. The fortification structures are particularly problematic for conventional archaeological interpretation. Defensive installations require threats to defend against, which implies organized conflict between sophisticated societies. But 7,000 years ago, human settlements were supposedly small, scattered, and technologically primitive, not organized enough to require or construct massive stone fortifications. The preservation beneath 40 meters of Arabian seawater creates its own category of impossibility. These depths place the structures well below any water level that could have existed during periods when Neolithic cultures were capable of construction. Either the ruins were built underwater, requiring engineering capabilities that exceed ancient achievements, or they were submerged by geological processes that don't appear in regional archaeological or geological records. The pottery and artifact assemblages recovered from the site compound the temporal mystery. The ceramic materials show evidence of sophisticated firing techniques, decorative traditions, and functional designs that suggest established craft specialization and possibly long-distance trade relationships. But craft specialization requires social organization, population density, and economic surplus that weren't supposed to exist in 7,000-year-old Neolithic India. The harbor installation hypothesis is the most challenging aspect of the discovery for maritime archaeological interpretation. The stone arrangements include what appear to be dock structures, mooring installations, and possibly breakwater systems designed to protect anchored vessels from wave action. But sophisticated harbor engineering requires maritime activity on a scale that implies international trade, large vessels, and navigational capabilities that predate documented evidence for such technologies by millennia. The dating controversy surrounding the Khambhat ruins reflects broader tensions within archaeological interpretation of underwater discoveries. Carbon dating of organic materials consistently returns ages around 7,000 years, but these results are so disruptive to established chronologies that many archaeologists prefer to question the dating methods rather than accept the implications of the evidence. The construction techniques visible in the underwater formations don't match any known Neolithic building tradition from the Indian subcontinent. The stone-cutting methods, assembly procedures, and architectural principles appear to represent technological capabilities that developed either much earlier than traditionally supposed, or were introduced from outside sources that aren't documented in archaeological records. The absence of human remains throughout the underwater ruins adds another layer to the mystery. No burials, no skeletal evidence, no indication of the population that would have been necessary to quarry, transport, and position megalithic building materials in complex architectural arrangements. The structures appear to have been abandoned cleanly, completely, without the demographic evidence that usually accompanies large-scale construction projects. The submersion mechanism remains geologically unexplained. Post-Ice Age sea level rise could account for some flooding, but the depths at which these structures rest require either catastrophic geological events or much earlier construction dates than any dating method has indicated. The combination of great depth and relatively recent organic dating creates a temporal geological paradox that challenges both archaeological and marine geological interpretation. Local oral traditions include stories of ancient underwater cities, of civilizations that built in stone and were swallowed by rising seas, of knowledge and technology that was lost when the waters claimed coastal settlements. These narratives provide cultural context for the archaeological discoveries, but they also suggest that the underwater ruins represent memories that have been preserved in folklore for millennia. The extended distribution of stone formations across the Gulf seafloor indicates that the Khambhat ruins are part of a larger complex of underwater archaeological sites. Sonar surveys reveal additional geometric anomalies, possible structural remains, and artificial modifications to the natural seafloor that suggest construction activity on a scale that dwarfs individual building projects. The regional archaeological landscape doesn't include contemporary settlements that show evidence of the technological sophistication or social organization necessary to plan and execute massive marine construction projects. The Khambhat ruins exist in cultural isolation, as if they were built by a civilization that left no other archaeological traces in the surrounding area. Modern underwater survey techniques allow detailed documentation of the stone arrangements, measurement of architectural features, and analysis of construction methods, but they don't provide explanations for how Neolithic cultures acquired megalithic building capabilities, or why they chose to construct fortifications and harbor installations in locations that would be submerged by rising water levels. The implications of authentic 7,000-year-old megalithic construction extend far beyond regional archaeological interpretation into fundamental questions about the pace and pattern of human technological development. If the Khambhat ruins represent genuine Neolithic achievement, they suggest that complex urban civilization developed much earlier and more rapidly than any current theory accounts for. The silence in historical records about these underwater installations feels particularly significant given their scale and sophistication. No ancient texts reference massive stone cities in the Arabian Sea. No classical authors describe underwater ruins off the Indian coast. No medieval chronicles mention submerged fortifications in the Gulf of Khambhat. The complete absence of documentary evidence suggests either very ancient origins that predate written records or systematic erasure from cultural memory. The Arabian Sea continues to protect the secrets of the Khambhat ruins as effectively as it preserves their megalithic stones. In the depths off India's northwest coast, massive defensive installations wait in the darkness, their purpose unknown, their builders unidentified, their existence challenging every assumption about when, where, and how human civilization learned to build with stone on a scale that impresses even in an age of modern construction technology. What kind of Neolithic culture builds megalithic fortifications beneath what would become ocean depths? What kind of prehistoric society possesses the organizational capability to execute massive stone construction projects while leaving no other archaeological evidence of its existence? And what other impossible ruins might be waiting in the depths, their stones still positioned according to ancient plans, their mysteries still sealed in chambers that haven't been opened since the ancient world decided that some achievements are too dangerous to remember? Story 18. Atlit Yam, the village where time drowned. 9,000 years ago, when human civilization was supposedly still learning the difference between hunting and farming, the people of Atlit Yam were building stone houses, digging sophisticated wells, and burying their dead in organized cemeteries, with burial practices that suggest social complexity, spiritual beliefs, and cultural continuity that spans generations. Today, their village lies 10 meters beneath the Mediterranean off Israel's coast, preserved in marine sediments like a Neolithic time capsule that challenges every assumption about the pace and pattern of early human settlement. Atlit Yam isn't just old, it's impossibly old. As one of the world's oldest known submerged settlements, it predates Stonehenge by several millennia, predates the Egyptian pyramids by thousands of years, and predates most civilizations that archaeology considers sophisticated by so much time that its very existence forces uncomfortable questions about what human societies were accomplishing during periods traditionally labeled as primitive. The preservation is unnervingly complete. Stone house foundations maintain their rectangular geometry, interior walls preserve room divisions and doorway alignments, and the village layout demonstrates urban planning principles that require centralized decision-making and community coordination. These aren't random shelters scattered across the landscape. They're organized residential architecture positioned according to deliberate design principles. But the cemetery is what transforms Atlit Yam from an archaeological curiosity into an existential challenge to historical timelines. The underwater graveyard contains dozens of human burials, with skeletons positioned according to consistent practices that suggest established funerary traditions, social hierarchies, and spiritual beliefs sophisticated enough to require formal expression through burial ritual. The skeletons themselves tell stories that Neolithic societies weren't supposed to have chapters for. Evidence of specialized diets, indicators of craft specialization, and signs of long-distance trade relationships that connected this coastal village to inland communities, and possibly international exchange networks. The bone chemistry reveals access to marine resources, agricultural products, and processed materials that indicate economic complexity and resource management capabilities. The well construction represents engineering achievement that exceeds what archaeology typically associates with 9,000-year-old settlements. The stone-lined water source required quarrying, transportation, and construction techniques that suggest accumulated technical knowledge and possibly specialized labor roles. Building functional wells demands understanding of hydrology, geology, and long-term community planning that implies social organization beyond simple family or tribal structures. The submersion timeline creates its own category of impossibility. For Atlit Yam to be underwater today, it must have been flooded by post-Ice Age sea level rise that occurred gradually over several millennia. But gradual flooding should have allowed for evacuation, salvage, and resettlement in higher locations. Instead, the village appears to have been abandoned intact, with personal possessions, architectural elements, and even human remains left in place. The dating methodology confirms the site's antiquity through multiple independent techniques: radiocarbon analysis of organic materials, geological assessment of sediment layers, and archaeological comparison with contemporary sites all support the 9,000-year age estimate. The convergence of evidence makes it impossible to dismiss Atlit Yam as dating error or methodological confusion. But accepting the site's authenticity requires accepting implications that challenge fundamental assumptions about Neolithic human capabilities. If 9,000-year-old communities possess the social organization evident at Atlit Yam, why don't other sites from the same period show similar sophistication? If early Neolithic societies could build permanent settlements with sophisticated infrastructure, why do traditional models of human development emphasize gradual technological progress over thousands of years? The artifact assemblages include tools, pottery, and worked materials that demonstrate technological capabilities beyond what archaeology traditionally attributes to early Neolithic cultures. The stone tool production shows evidence of specialized techniques, the ceramic work indicates controlled firing methods, and the organic material processing suggests food preparation and storage technologies that require accumulated cultural knowledge. The architectural evidence suggests a community that expected permanence. The house foundations are designed for multi-generational occupation, the well construction represents significant resource investment, and the overall village layout demonstrates long-term planning rather than temporary settlement. These aren't people who built expecting to move on. They built expecting their children and grandchildren to inherit their infrastructure. The marine environment that now preserves Atlit Yam creates research conditions that don't exist at terrestrial archaeological sites. The underwater preservation allows study of organic materials, spatial relationships, and environmental contexts that would have been destroyed by exposure to air and terrestrial decay processes. The submersion that ended the village's active life also created ideal conditions for studying how the village functioned. Local geological studies indicate that the coastal area around Atlit Yam has been subject to significant sea level changes over the past 10,000 years. But the specific pattern of flooding that submerged the village doesn't match gradual sea level rise models. The preservation suggests relatively rapid inundation that prevented salvage operations while maintaining architectural integrity. The absence of contemporary settlements with similar characteristics compounds the mystery of Atlit Yam's sophistication. Other 9,000-year-old sites in the Levant show evidence of early Neolithic culture, but none demonstrate the level of social organization, architectural planning, or technological capability evident in the underwater village. Atlit Yam appears to represent cultural achievement that was either highly localized or has been lost from the archaeological record through preservation accidents. The diving experience at Atlit Yam is profoundly disorienting because the underwater village maintains its spatial organization and architectural logic despite being completely submerged. You can swim along ancient pathways, peer into house foundations where Neolithic families lived, and encounter burial sites where the community's dead have been resting for 9 millennia. The cemetery sections are particularly haunting because the skeletal remains preserve evidence of individual lives, family relationships, and community social structures. The burials include children, adults, and elderly individuals, suggesting a stable population that lived, aged, and died in this coastal location over extended periods. These aren't the remains of transient hunter-gatherers, they're evidence of settled community life. Modern underwater archaeology techniques allow detailed study of Atlit Yam's spatial organization, architectural features, and artifact distributions, but they don't explain how a 9,000-year-old community acquired the technological and social capabilities evident throughout the site. Each survey documents more evidence of Neolithic sophistication that doesn't fit into established models of human cultural development. The scientific implications of Atlit Yam extend beyond archaeology into broader questions about the pace of human cultural evolution, the relationship between environmental change and social organization, and the possibility that early human societies achieved levels of complexity that have been systematically underestimated by modern scholarship. The Mediterranean continues to preserve Atlit Yam's secrets in marine sediments that protect organic materials, spatial relationships, and environmental contexts for future research. In the waters off Israel's coast, a 9,000-year-old village waits in the underwater darkness, its houses still organized according to Neolithic community planning, its cemetery still containing the remains of people who lived more sophisticated lives than human societies, were supposed to be capable of 9 millennia ago. What kind of Neolithic community builds permanent villages with sophisticated infrastructure and organized cemeteries? What kind of early human society possesses the social organization necessary for multi-generational settlement while leaving no contemporary archaeological parallels? And what other impossible ancient villages might be waiting beneath the world's coastal waters, their stones still positioned according to plans that predate recorded history, their secrets still sealed in foundations that were built when human civilization was supposedly just beginning to organize itself into the complex societies that would eventually build pyramids, temples, and the modern world? Story 19. Neapolis, the Roman city that vanished in a day. In 2017, marine archaeologists exploring the Gulf of Gabes off Tunisia's coast discovered something that shouldn't exist. A complete Roman city lying beneath just a few meters of Mediterranean water, with its streets, houses, and public buildings preserved with the kind of detail that makes underwater exploration feel like walking through Pompeii with diving gear instead of dust masks. Neapolis, dating to the 4th century before the Common Era, spans 20 hectares of seafloor, where mosaic floors maintain their geometric patterns and cistern systems preserve their engineered precision, as if the city was designed to function underwater rather than having been accidentally submerged. The discovery timeline itself defies comfortable archaeological explanation. Ancient sources reference Neapolis as a thriving commercial center, a major port that connected Roman Africa to Mediterranean trade networks, a city wealthy enough to mint its own coins, and important enough to warrant mention in classical geographical texts. But these same sources provide no account of the city's destruction, no explanation for its disappearance, no record of catastrophic events that might have erased such a significant urban center from the historical map. The preservation beneath the Gulf of Gabes is unsettling in its completeness. Roman urban planning remains clearly visible in the underwater street grid, residential districts maintain their architectural organization, and public infrastructure preserves its functional relationships. These aren't random ruins scattered by centuries of marine degradation. They're organized urban spaces that maintain their civic logic, despite being completely submerged. The mosaic floors are perhaps the most haunting discovery. These delicate artistic installations, composed of thousands of small stones arranged in complex patterns, should have been destroyed by wave action, scattered by currents, or buried by sediment accumulation over the past 16 centuries. Instead, they lie intact on the seafloor, their colors still vivid, their geometric designs still perfect, as if they were installed yesterday, rather than during the late Roman Empire. The tsunami hypothesis offers the most dramatic explanation for Neapolis's sudden disappearance. Historical records document a massive earthquake in 365 Common Era that generated tsunamis across the eastern Mediterranean, destroying cities, flooding coastal areas, and reshaping regional geography. But the tsunami explanation creates its own problems. If Neapolis was destroyed by catastrophic flooding, why are its architectural remains so perfectly preserved? Why do the underwater ruins show no evidence of violent destruction, chaotic debris fields, or the kind of structural damage typically associated with tsunami impact? The timing discrepancy compounds the mystery. The 365 Common Era earthquake is documented in multiple historical sources, but these accounts don't specifically mention Neapolis among the cities destroyed by resulting tsunamis. The absence of contemporary records describing the city's destruction suggests either that the disaster was less catastrophic than the archaeological evidence implies, or that Neapolis's end was systematically erased from historical memory, for reasons that remain unclear. The geological evidence for tsunami impact remains frustratingly inconclusive. Marine sediment analysis around the Neapolis site shows evidence of past flooding events, but the geological signatures don't clearly match patterns typically associated with tsunami deposition. The sediment layers suggest water flow patterns that might have resulted from various causes: earthquake-generated waves, storm surge, or even gradual sea level change. The urban planning visible in underwater Neapolis demonstrates Roman engineering capabilities that were specifically designed to manage water flow, drainage, and flood control. The city's infrastructure includes sophisticated cistern systems, drainage channels, and possibly flood barriers exactly the kind of installations that should have protected against the rising water levels that eventually submerged the entire settlement. But Roman engineering, sophisticated as it was, apparently couldn't prevent Neapolis from disappearing beneath the Mediterranean with such thoroughness that its existence was forgotten until underwater archaeologists rediscovered it 16 centuries later. The failure of Roman water management technology to protect the city raises uncomfortable questions about the scale and nature of whatever geological event caused the submersion. The artifact distribution throughout underwater Neapolis doesn't match patterns typically associated with catastrophic destruction or gradual abandonment. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests systematic organization, as if valuable objects were deliberately arranged and protected before the submersion occurred. This raises questions about whether the city's flooding was truly unexpected, or whether residents had some advance warning of impending disaster. The absence of human remains in the underwater ruins is both reassuring and mysterious. No skeletons, no evidence of casualties, no indication that people were trapped by sudden flooding. Either the population evacuated completely before the submersion, which implies advance warning, or the bodies were removed or relocated after the disaster, which suggests organized recovery efforts that aren't documented in any surviving historical sources. Local oral traditions speak of a city swallowed by the sea, a settlement that violated divine law and was punished with submersion. But these folklore accounts provide supernatural explanations without geological specifics, and their relationship to actual historical events remains unclear. The legends might preserve cultural memory of Neapolis's destruction, or they might simply provide narrative frameworks for understanding unexplained underwater discoveries. The modern fishing communities around the Gulf of Gabes have long reported nets snagging on underwater stone formations, areas where bottom trawling encounters artificial obstacles that shouldn't exist in natural marine environments. These accounts suggest that local populations have been aware of underwater ruins for much longer than official archaeological recognition, but the knowledge remained embedded in maritime folklore rather than academic investigation. The conservation challenges posed by underwater Neapolis reflect broader problems in marine archaeology. The site exists in a dynamic marine environment, subject to storms, currents, and human activities that threaten the preservation conditions that have maintained the ruins for 16 centuries. Tourism pressure, fishing operations, and coastal development all pose risks to archaeological features that have survived since the late Roman Empire. The diving experience at Neapolis is profoundly disorienting because the underwater city maintains its urban functionality despite being completely submerged. You can follow ancient Roman streets, explore residential neighborhoods, and encounter public buildings that preserve their civic purposes, even though they now serve as habitat for marine life rather than human communities. The Mediterranean continues to reveal new sections of Neapolis as shifting sands expose previously buried architectural features, and changing weather patterns provide access to areas that have been inaccessible to underwater investigation. Each new discovery adds to the evidence that the submerged city was larger, more sophisticated, and more economically significant than surviving historical records suggested. But each discovery also deepens the fundamental mystery. How does a major Roman commercial center disappear so completely from historical memory while remaining so perfectly preserved beneath just a few meters of water? The preservation conditions that protect Neapolis's mosaics, architecture, and urban infrastructure also preserve evidence of sophisticated Roman engineering that was specifically designed to prevent the kind of catastrophic flooding that apparently destroyed the city. The cistern systems found throughout underwater Neapolis represent Roman hydraulic engineering at its most sophisticated. These installations were designed to collect, store, and distribute water for urban populations during both normal conditions and emergency situations. The engineering includes overflow mechanisms, filtration systems, and distribution networks that should have provided protection against flood conditions, yet the entire city still ended up underwater. The street layouts preserve evidence of Roman urban planning principles that emphasize drainage, traffic flow, and public health considerations. The roads are positioned to channel water away from residential areas. The public spaces are designed to accommodate large gatherings without creating bottlenecks. And the overall city organization reflects centuries of accumulated experience in building urban environments that could withstand natural disasters and human pressures. Yet all this sophisticated planning and engineering proved insufficient to prevent Neapolis from vanishing beneath the Mediterranean with such completeness that its existence was forgotten, until modern underwater archaeology rediscovered it as if it were a lost civilization rather than a documented Roman city. The economic evidence suggests that Neapolis was a prosperous commercial center, with trade connections extending across the Mediterranean and into the African interior. The archaeological remains include evidence of metalworking, ceramic production, and luxury goods that indicate both local manufacturing capabilities and access to international markets. This wasn't a peripheral settlement that could disappear without notice. It was a significant economic node whose loss should have disrupted regional trade patterns and warranted extensive documentation. The coinage evidence adds another layer to the mystery. Neapolis minted its own money, which means it possessed the political authority, economic resources, and technical capabilities necessary for operating monetary systems. Cities that mint coins don't usually vanish without leaving extensive records of their political relationships, economic activities, and administrative structures. Yet Neapolis disappeared from history as thoroughly as it disappeared beneath the waves. The relationship between underwater Neapolis and other Roman sites in North Africa raises questions about broader patterns of urban abandonment and preservation in the late imperial period. Were other Roman cities experiencing similar pressures from rising sea levels, geological instability, or environmental changes that aren't well documented in surviving historical sources? Or was Neapolis unique in its vulnerability to whatever catastrophic event caused its submersion? Modern climate research suggests that the Mediterranean region experienced significant environmental changes during the late Roman period, including shifts in temperature, precipitation patterns, and possibly sea level fluctuations. These changes could have created conditions that made coastal cities more vulnerable to flooding, storm damage, or gradual submersion. But environmental pressures typically produce gradual abandonment, rather than the sudden disappearance that characterizes Neapolis's archaeological signature. The silence in Byzantine historical sources about Neapolis's fate is particularly significant. Given that the Eastern Roman Empire maintained extensive administrative records and chronicled major events affecting urban centers throughout the Mediterranean, the absence of documentation about such a significant city's destruction suggests either that the event occurred outside normal administrative attention, or that records of the disaster were deliberately suppressed or lost. Local archaeological surveys around the Gulf of Gabes have revealed additional underwater features that might be connected to Neapolis, harbor installations, defensive structures, and possibly residential districts that extend the city's footprint beyond the main archaeological site. These discoveries suggest that underwater Neapolis represents only a portion of what was once a much larger urban complex. The implications of Neapolis's preservation and disappearance extend beyond regional archaeology into broader questions about urban vulnerability, environmental change, and the relationship between human settlement patterns and geological processes. If a sophisticated Roman city with advanced engineering could vanish so completely, what does that suggest about the long-term stability of contemporary coastal urban centers? The Gulf of Gabes continues to protect Neapolis's secrets beneath Mediterranean waters that preserve Roman mosaics, architectural details, and urban infrastructure with clarity that makes the submerged city accessible to underwater exploration, while simultaneously hiding it from surface observation. The preservation conditions that maintain the ruins also conceal them, creating an archaeological site that exists in plain sight beneath a few meters of water, while remaining invisible to anyone who doesn't specifically know where to look. In the clear waters off Tunisia's coast, Roman Neapolis waits with the patience of engineered stone and the persistence of urban planning that continues to function, even when completely submerged. Its streets still organize underwater neighborhoods, its public buildings still define civic spaces, and its preservation still challenges everything. Archaeology thinks it understands about how Roman cities end and why some disappearances are documented, while others are forgotten so completely that rediscovery feels like resurrection rather than investigation. What kind of catastrophe erases major Roman cities from historical memory while preserving their architecture in perfect underwater condition? What kind of geological event overwhelms sophisticated Roman engineering while maintaining the delicate artistic installations that should be the first casualties of destructive flooding? And what other forgotten Roman cities might be waiting beneath Mediterranean waters, Their coins still mintable, their mosaics still perfect, their disappearance still unexplained by either history or geology. Story 20. Tartessos, the Atlantis that history forgot. Off the coast of Cadiz, Spain, where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Mediterranean Sea and ancient trade routes converged like rivers of silver and gold, lie the underwater ruins of what might be the most historically significant lost civilization never properly found. Tartessos, the wealthy kingdom that classical sources described with the kind of reverent awe usually reserved for myths, but which archaeological evidence suggests was devastatingly, undeniably real. Tartessos wasn't supposed to be a mystery. Ancient Greek and Phoenician texts reference it extensively as a major trading partner, a source of incredible mineral wealth, a civilization so prosperous that its kings supposedly ate from silver mangers, and its common citizens used silver currency for everyday transactions. The kingdom controlled vast mining operations, dominated Atlantic trade routes, and possessed technological capabilities that impressed even the sophisticated Mediterranean civilizations that encountered it. And then it vanished with such thoroughness that for centuries, scholars debated whether Tartessos had ever existed at all, or was simply ancient propaganda designed to justify Greek and Phoenician commercial expeditions into the dangerous waters beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The underwater ruins off Cadiz suggest that the ancient sources weren't exaggerating, they were understating. The stone walls that rise from the Atlantic seafloor don't whisper of a modest trading post or regional power. They proclaim a civilization that built on a scale that challenges every assumption about prehistoric Atlantic capabilities. These are harbor installations designed for major international commerce, defensive structures positioned to control ocean access routes, and urban infrastructure that implies population centers and resource extraction operations on an industrial scale. The artifacts recovered from the underwater sites tell stories that don't fit comfortably into established timelines of European technological development. Worked metals demonstrate smelting and alloying techniques that were supposed to be innovations of later civilizations. Pottery shows evidence of manufacturing methods and decorative traditions that suggest established craft specialization and possibly international cultural exchange. Carved stones preserve symbols and artistic motifs that don't match any known Iberian cultural tradition. The timing of Tartessos' disappearance coincides uncomfortably with Plato's account of Atlantis' destruction. Both civilizations allegedly vanished around the 6th century before Common Era. Both were described as wealthy Atlantic maritime powers, and both disappeared so completely that their existence became matters of scholarly debate rather than historical fact. The coincidence feels too perfect to be accidental, unless it isn't coincidence at all. Because what if Tartessos was Atlantis? Not the mystical island empire of New Age speculation, but the actual historical civilization that inspired Plato's account. The geographical positioning matches. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, controlling Atlantic access, positioned to dominate Mediterranean, Atlantic trade. The chronology aligns. Both civilizations reached their peak during the early first millennium before Common Era, and both vanished during the same general time period. The mineral wealth that ancient sources attributed to Tartessos wasn't mythological, it was geological reality. The Iberian Peninsula contains some of Europe's richest metal deposits, including silver, copper, tin, and gold in concentrations that would have made control of these resources incredibly valuable for any civilization operating in the Bronze and early Iron Ages. The kingdom wasn't wealthy because of trade, it was wealthy because it controlled the sources of materials that made trade valuable. The harbor installations preserved beneath Atlantic waters off Cadiz represent engineering capabilities that exceed anything traditionally attributed to prehistoric Iberian cultures. These aren't simple fishing village docks. They're sophisticated port facilities designed to accommodate large vessels, manage heavy cargo loads, and control access to inland river systems that connected coastal settlements to interior mining operations. The defensive structures compound the mystery of Tartessos' technological sophistication. The underwater ruins include what appear to be fortification walls, possibly watchtowers, and strategic positioning that suggests military planners who understood both terrestrial and maritime defensive requirements. But defending against what? And why would such elaborate defensive installations prove insufficient to prevent the civilization's complete disappearance? The submersion mechanism remains geologically unexplained. the Atlantic coastline around Cadiz has been relatively stable over the past several millennia, without the kind of catastrophic sea level changes or tectonic activity that would be necessary to submerge major harbor installations. Yet here lie the ruins, positioned at depths that suggest either very ancient construction dates or very sudden geological events. The absence of Tartessos from later historical records feels deliberately complete. For a civilization that dominated Atlantic trade for several centuries, the silence in subsequent Greek, Roman, and local chronicles suggests either systematic erasure from historical memory or catastrophic destruction so complete that no institutional memory survived to document what had been lost. Local oral traditions preserve stories that sound suspiciously like cultural memories of Tartessos rather than folklore about generic lost civilizations. Tales of wealthy kingdoms swallowed by the Atlantic, of mining operations that extracted silver from the earth until divine punishment brought flooding, of ships that sailed beyond the known world and returned with treasures that made kings out of common sailors. The connection to Atlantis becomes more compelling when you consider that Plato claimed his account came from Egyptian priests who preserved memories of ancient civilizations in temple records. Egyptian texts do reference trade relationships with Atlantic peoples, mining operations that provided materials for temple construction, and maritime expeditions that traveled beyond the Mediterranean into unknown Western waters. Modern underwater archaeology techniques allow detailed documentation of the Cadiz ruins, but they don't explain how prehistoric Iberian cultures acquired the technological capabilities evident in the submerged installations. Each survey reveals more evidence of sophisticated engineering, advanced construction methods, and organizational coordination that doesn't fit into established models of European cultural development during the first millennium before Common Era. The artifact assemblages include materials that suggest long-distance trade relationships extending far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Worked amber that originated in northern Europe, carved ivory that came from African sources, and possibly metallurgical products that required raw materials from multiple continents. Tartessos wasn't just a local Atlantic power, it was a hub in prehistoric global trade networks. The diving experience around the Cadiz ruins is disorienting because the underwater archaeology preserves evidence of commercial and military capabilities that don't match traditional models of prehistoric Atlantic civilizations. You can explore harbor installations designed for international commerce, examine defensive structures positioned to control ocean access routes, and encounter artifacts that suggest technological sophistication and cultural connections spanning continents. The Atlantic continues to reveal new sections of what might be Tartessos as changing weather patterns, shifting sands, and improved underwater survey techniques expose previously hidden archaeological features. Each discovery adds to the evidence that the underwater ruins represent a civilization that was larger, wealthier, and more technologically advanced than any prehistoric Atlantic culture was supposed to be. But each discovery also deepens the fundamental mystery. If Tartessos was as sophisticated and wealthy as the archaeological evidence suggests, why did its destruction leave no clear traces in historical records? If the civilization controlled Atlantic trade routes and maintained relationships with Mediterranean powers, why did its disappearance not disrupt international commerce enough to warrant extensive documentation? The silence surrounding Tartessos' end is perhaps more unsettling than the silence surrounding its beginning, because civilizations that build harbor installations, develop international trade networks, and accumulate the kind of wealth that impresses classical Mediterranean societies don't usually vanish without leaving extensive evidence of their collapse, their evacuation, or their conquest by other powers. Unless something happened to Tartessos that was so catastrophic, so unprecedented, that no contemporary civilization possessed the conceptual frameworks necessary to document or understand what they were witnessing, unless the destruction was so complete that it erased not just the physical civilization, but the cultural memory of how such destruction was possible. In the Atlantic waters off Cadiz, stone walls that might have guarded the harbors of Atlantis rise from the seafloor like archaeological questions carved in underwater limestone. Their builders possess capabilities that challenge established timelines. Their disappearance created silences that challenge historical memory, and their preservation challenges everything we think we understand about how advanced civilizations end. and why some endings are documented while others are forgotten so completely that rediscovery feels like resurrection rather than archaeology. What kind of prehistoric Atlantic civilization builds harbor installations that survive underwater for millennia while leaving no clear traces in historical memory? What kind of destruction erases wealthy kingdoms so thoroughly that their existence becomes matters of scholarly debate? And what other impossible civilizations might be waiting beneath the world's oceans, their stones still positioned according to ancient plans, their wealth still scattered across seafloors, their secrets still sealed in chambers that haven't been opened since the ancient world decided that some memories are too dangerous to preserve above the waves? The Atlantic keeps many secrets beneath its restless surface, but Tartessos might be the most profound. A civilization that achieved everything classical sources associated with wealth, power, and technological sophistication, only to discover that the ocean remembers what history forgets, and that sometimes the greatest kingdoms are preserved not in chronicles or monuments, but in the silence between waves and the spaces where land used to be.